When the original Gold and Silver released in 1999, Game Freak said they didn't feel fully complete, not even close. Series creator Satoshi Tajiri looked ahead to the future and prognosticated, saying, "I'm thinking that the best Pokemon game will be released sooner rather than later, but whether or not it'll be the best Pokemon game is something I can't achieve on my own. From here on out, kids who grew up playing may grow up to be game developers, right? And if those kids have the same vision as us, then I definitely think it's possible to expand the world of Pokemon by working together with them." Tajiri's prediction came true. At sunup the day Gold and Silver released in Japan, a young Takao Uno was in line at the store waiting to buy them. 10 years later, he was art director for those games' remakes. Game Freak made Fire Red and Leaf Green in just over a year, but went all out and spent 3 years on HeartGold and Soul Silver. With the highest review scores in the entire franchise, you could say these are the best Pokemon games that Tajiri predicted. Not bad, considering they were made by a team of just a dozen guys. In this video, we're going to translate some old Japanese magazines and websites to find new information about HeartGold and Soul Silver, go behind the scenes, and see how Game Freak pulled it off. For preservation's sake, we'll publicly archive every interview translation we did for this video, so you can read them in full, linked in this video's description. The love put into HeartGold and Soul Silver smacks you in the face as soon as you walk out your front door. In the original New Bark town, there's a sign that says, "The town where winds of a new beginning blow." But you kinda had to use your imagination, because there wasn't any wind. And most kids probably never even took the time to read the sign. In one of these Japanese magazines, Takao Uno says he did read it, and it made a huge impression on him. So for the remakes, he added some windmills and actual wind, so New Bark Town lived up to the promise of that 10-year-old sign. He said, "As a fan myself, I made these games something I would want to play. I worked to make the Gold and Silver I remembered from the Game Boy era a wider, more vibrant, and more fun world. So I hope you'll enjoy exploring it side by side with your favorite Pokemon." Speaking of exploring side by side, you could say that's why the remakes are called HeartGold and Soul Silver. Walking Pokemon was director Shigeki Morimoto's idea, who said, "We considered a lot of options for the titles, and thought about things like how you can walk around with Pokemon, and the relationship between Ho-Oh and Lugia. We concluded that a major theme of these games is sharing meaningful experiences with Pokemon, so we chose Heart and Soul to communicate that idea." There's a section in one of these magazines called The Secret Story of Walking with Pokemon. In the earlier Sinnoh games, you could only walk with Pokemon in one little area, not the entire game world. But Game Freak was determined to make it possible in Johto. They drew overworld sprites for all 493 Pokemon, plus gender differences and shinies, and added animations. Not just for walking, but also thousands of little reactions when you talk to them, or situations that only happen with certain Pokemon in specific locations. Making sure Pokemon didn't get caught up on weird terrain was especially tricky, and the whole initiative was arguably the most difficult part of the entire game's development. Takao Uno was speechless when Morimoto told him they were really gonna do it. Quote, "I was shocked, but it was our dream to let players walk through this wide world together with their Pokemon, so even though it was exhausting work, I just thought, it's gonna be worth it while I was drawing them. I thought, if it'll make the fans happy, I'll do it." After all, they did it with one Pokemon back in Yellow version. All the devs agreed, we can't lose to a 10-year-old Game Boy game. It was Nintendo who proposed the idea of letting players walk with their Pokemon in real life, by bundling every copy of HeartGold and Soul Silver with a pedometer called the Pokewalker, which let fans transfer over their favorite monsters to take for walks and gain EXP. Pokemon Company president Ishihara actually wanted to try and sell 6 Pokewalkers to fans, so they'd have a full team just like a real Pokemon trainer. It's those kinds of ideas that made him the merchandise kingpin he is today, and earned him the nickname the King of Portable Toys. They ended up not pushing to have fans buy 6 of them, probably for the best, as it would have cost kids a small fortune. The Pokewalker's designer Shigeru Omori did carry 6 of them though. He was another one of Tajiri's predictions that came true. He said, "I was a student when I played Gold and Silver. It was interesting to work on a game that fascinated me 10 years ago. I wish for everyone to have the chance to find something that fascinates them at a young age so they can carry that passion into their adult life." For a lot of folks watching this video, we imagine that last part describes y'all's relationship with Pokemon to this very day. Even though HeartGold and SoulSilver didn't introduce any brand new Pokemon, they did change a few old ones, in subtle ways you probably never even noticed. Ken Sugimori made all the original Gold and Silver artwork, and he returned to ink a new art set for the remakes. The most obvious change is his entire art style. Back in the old days, he said he was basically using watercolor to imitate Akira Toriyama's style. You know, the Dragon Ball guy. But as he got older, he didn't want to do that anymore, and moved on to something new. In a Nintendo Dream magazine we translated, they asked Sugimori about his philosophy for the remake's art set. He said he didn't want to make any big changes, cause that'd upset fans who loved a particular Pokemon since childhood, and would hate to see it suddenly look different. Quote, "Every Pokemon is somebody's favorite, and Pokemon belong to everyone, so I try not to change them too much." So the new artworks aren't so much remakes as they are remasters with subtle updates, like Meganium's flower, for example, and Stantler's tail, which was originally white but changed to brown. Gligar's claws and wing spikes aren't white anymore either, now they're pink. Scissor's got 3 abdomen sternites when he originally only had 2, and Ursaring used to have 4 claws on each paw, but now he's got 5. Sugimori also changed the finger counts on Haunter and Mr. Mime a few years earlier. In our video covering the Kanto remakes, we talked about the Japanese taboo against 4-fingered characters, and how it's considered offensive to people who've lost fingers, like butchers and meat packers. About a dozen Johto Pokemon's poses were identical to 10 years earlier, but Sugimori explained why he changed the rest of them. He said, "There are some Pokemon poses that I've grown tired of seeing after 10 years and made changes to. But if I thought a pose looked as cool as it could get, I left it the way it was. An official illustration needs to be from a perspective that shows everything you need to know to understand a Pokemon, which can be very difficult. That said, I aimed to draw most Pokemon so you could see them from a fresh perspective." And of course, a lot of Pokemon colors look different, but we're mostly going to chalk that up to Sugimori's new art style. Speaking of different colors, there actually was one new Pokemon variant added in HeartGold and SoulSilver, the time-traveling, female-only Spiky-eared Pichu. But she was originally going to be a white Pichu, which we know thanks to Shoko Nakagawa. She's a host of some Japanese TV shows like Pokemon Sunday, and also Spiky-eared Pichu's voice actress. We bought Shoko's autobiography from Japan, where she reveals, quote, "Originally, Spiky-eared Pichu was going to be white Pichu instead, and I heard they were even thinking about making a brand of white cream stew to go along with it and everything. But they eventually went with Spiky-eared Pichu instead." The Japanese words for white Pichu and white stew are nearly identical, Howaito Pichu and Howaito Shichu, so the marketing would have written itself. As the largest media franchise in the world, the Pokemon company's always looking for new merchandising opportunities wherever they can get them. We also got a visual of white Pichu thanks to Shoko. In 2014, there was a Pokemon art exhibit in Tokyo, with strict rules against photography, but Shoko flaunted those rules and snapped this picture. It looks like Game Freak considered a few other variants as well, like Heart Cheek Pichu and Pichu with a bad haircut. They ended up picking Spiky-eared Pichu, but you could say she's a lost Pokemon too, in her own way. She can travel through time with Celebi, but she can never be transferred off a HeartGold or SoulSilver cartridge, so she'll always be stuck, forever, in the Johto remakes. Well, except she is in Smash Bros. Ultimate. Maybe she time-traveled a couple console generations into the future. The game's sound was another major focus, with HeartGold and SoulSilver being the first in the series to include environmental sound effects. In these magazines, lead audio designer Go Ichinose says Johto'd feel lonely if the sound didn't live up to the new visuals, and recounted his struggles to make nature come alive all over Johto. What you're actually hearing are sound files ripped from the game's data. In normal play, you'd barely hear them over the game's music, which makes the effort all the more admirable. In a speech at the 2023 CDEC Developers Conference, Ichinose said adding all those environmental sounds was incredibly expensive because they all had to be placed in the overworld manually, tile by tile. To keep costs from getting completely out of control, he says they eventually had to give up on placing those kind of sounds with human hands, and switch to using procedural generation in later gens. That's a surprisingly interesting story all on its own, but it's pretty in-depth and really more relevant to Legends Arceus, so we'll save it for a future video. Boasting 270 tracks, HeartGold and SoulSilver had a massive OST. A Super Music Collection CD was released physically in Japan. It did release internationally 5 years later, but only in a digital format as a $10 iTunes download. Ichinose said Johto has a strong Japanese motif, so they made its music also sound very Japanese. On the other hand, Sinnoh's music was a bit more mature and a bit cooler. And before that, he said Hoenn was hot, so the musical theme was that its music should be hot too. When Ichinose looked back on that Gargantuan soundtrack, one track in particular stuck out in his memory. He said, "When I was making Lugia's battle theme, I looked at a ridiculous amount of artwork and videos, and thought about Lugia all day and dreamed about Lugia all night. At some point, I fell in love. It's my favorite Johto Pokemon. So was it worth dreaming about all day and night? Here's what he ended up with. We'll let you be the judge." By the way, while we're rooting around in the game's files, we found this unused sound effect for Snorlax's snoring. And also some unused wind sounds. Oh yeah, and HeartGold and SoulSilver's protagonist Ethan is a ninja, but only in the remakes. Ken Sugimori made the original Gen 2 protagonists Ethan and Chris to look pretty Western, but the new art director, Takao Uno, said he remade Ethan to look more Japanese in the remakes. In one of these magazine translations, he says, "We wanted to make him more Japanese, or rather, make him look kind of like a ninja." Someone asks if he actually is a ninja, and Uno says, "He sure is. He has the tapered pants and the tight clothes." HeartGold and SoulSilver recreate Crystal version's content, so it's a bit strange that Crystal's female protagonist Chris is nowhere to be found in the new Johto. According to Uno, that was sort of an accident, because he started drawing the remake's female protagonist without thinking to look back at Sugimori's Gen 2 artwork. First and foremost, he designed her thinking she'd be walking with her Pokemon a lot, so he gave her good walking clothes, shorts and overalls, unlike Dawn in Diamond and Pearl who wears a skirt. The girl he ended up with looked nothing like Chris, so he just decided to name her Lyra and not try and say she's still the original character. That's why Chris got written out of the remakes, even though Ethan got to stick around. By the way, if you're wondering why Dawn wore a skirt in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, it's because Masuda wanted her that way. To quote him from one of these Japanese magazines, he says, "I really like skirts, so I insisted the female protagonist should wear one in Diamond and Pearl." Anyway, we'll get more into these Gen 4 translations in our next Sinnoh video.
The death of a beloved icon, Pokemon executives racing to take advantage, the imprisonment of an author. This is the story of Pokemon's greatest failure. It flopped so hard we can almost guarantee you've never heard it before. And it all stems from a plan that was supposed to make the Pokemon company billions, but the only thing it ended up earning was embarrassment. Understandably, the company's not too keen on preserving the story or its fruits, but today we're gonna tell it, and upload all that remains to the Internet Archive for preservation. This is the story of Pikachu Meets the Press. It's a bizarre tale, and as is often the case on this channel, some folks might not believe it. So right off the bat, we're gonna outline our sources to back it all up. To get the facts, we had to translate a good chunk of a 600-page Japanese book called Pokemon Story, which was co-authored by Masakazu Kubo, who behind the scenes was the most important Pokemon executive you've probably never heard of. In Japan, he is often called the father of Pokemon. Back in the earliest days of the franchise, he was the guy promoting it in magazines like CoroCoro, helping Pokemon get a head start when no one else cared. His company Shogakukan owns a lot of Pokemon's printing and animation rights, and Kubo himself was executive producer of the early movies and anime. His book Pokemon Story is an extremely detailed account of Pokemon as a business, advertising budgets, marketing strategies, the kind of stuff Poketubers don't usually cover. Pokemon Story is where a lot of this video's info comes from, along with bits and pieces from various other old Japanese magazines. Okay, so with all that sourcing made clear, let's get this tale unfurled. It was the year 2000, the dawn of the Pokemon era, but the sun was also setting on the era of a comic strip called Peanuts. Circulating in over 2,000 newspapers reaching hundreds of millions of readers, Charlie Brown and his dog Snoopy were up there with Mickey Mouse as some of the most recognized and beloved characters of all time. With the first comic written by Charles Schulz in 1950, some people called Peanuts the longest story ever told by one human being. It had been adapted into movies, TV shows, toys, everything Pokémon was now becoming. But tragically, in early 2000, Charles Schulz was dying of cancer. His comic writing days were over. Pokémon's corporate leaders saw an opening, so they all got together to work out how to take his place. According to Pokémon Story, with Snoopy now finished, of the 2,000 newspapers across America, at least 200 now had empty pages that urgently need filling. The earnings from serialization are small, but the royalties from compilation books are considerable, and Pokémon can copy the path of Peanuts. Greeting millions of Americans in their homes every morning was a profitable marketing opportunity. But with Charles Schulz on his deathbed, the clock was ticking. Pokémon Company President Tsunekazu Ishihara asked, "How much power do these newspapers have?" Someone answered, "They come out daily, so it's beyond measure. We don't want to miss this window of opportunity. Now's the perfect timing, but it's coming down to the wire." The execs ultimately decided, even if the comic itself didn't make much money, the exposure was equivalent to $2 billion worth of advertising. That was just for 200 newspapers. Presumably, if they could take all 2,000 papers currently putting out Peanuts, it'd be worth billions more. Next to the games, anime, and trading cards, these comics would be Pokémon's fourth pillar holding up their plan to win the West. 1 week after that meeting, Charles Schulz was dead. The Pokémon Company had to act fast. To write the comic, they hired Gerard Jones. Back in 2000, he was a respected author working for both of the big two, Marvel and DC Comics, writing stuff like Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man, plus the English versions of Pokémon Adventures and Dragon Ball. So on paper at least, Jones probably seemed like the perfect guy for the job. To do the art, they got Ashura Benimaru Ito. Throughout the 90s, he'd done Super Metroid comics, Earthbound, Star Fox comics, again, seemingly the best man for the job. He also did some miscellaneous Pokémon art here and there, with Pokémon Snap standing out as some of his best. Ashura was an executive at Creatures Inc., co-owner of the Pokémon brand, and objectively the organization's quirkiest personality. He's really into wearing leopard skin clothes, sometimes with a tail, even to business meetings. To quote the late great Satoru Iwata, "Things always get weird when Ashura shows up." He was always doing stuff like making CG models of himself in leopard skins, growling, printed them out as stickers, and handed them out to everyone in his office. Quirky though he may be, Ashura's literally a rock star, not to mention a hell of an artist. With seasoned veterans like Jones and Ashura behind the wheel, the new Pokémon comic was primed for success. As well as Jones and Ashura, bringing up the rear was an experienced 3-person editorial team, along with additional support from Nintendo, Creatures Inc., Viz, and Creators Syndicate. What could possibly go wrong? The first strip debuted a few months later, starring Ash, Misty, and Pikachu on their first day of school. Yeah, they go to actual school, where they learn history and US government. We'll circle back to that later. Over its run, Brock, Ash's mom, and Gary showed up as regular characters too, along with some Pokémon more than others, especially Pikachu and Metapod. Color comics on Sunday, black and white the rest of the week. The black and whites each had a hidden Pokémon, like this one for example. Can you spot the hidden Magnemite? It's right here. Sunday comics often had puzzles attached, like Poke word searches or Who's That Pokemon type stuff. Now's probably a good time to mention, our longtime friend and art preservationist Hi-Res Pokemon scanned every single strip in high resolution for us. So huge thanks to that legend. And there'll be a download link in this video's description if you want to read them all and do the puzzles yourself. A lot of storylines were spread out over a week or two's worth of newspapers, then they were finished. Like Ash preparing for a battle against Gary and getting beat, for example. Other stories were peppered throughout the whole series, as sort of the main recurring plot lines, like Misty crushing on Ash, which peaked on Valentine's with a week of Misty badgering him for a romantic gesture. Another was Brock's horniness, similar to the kind of horn dogging you see in the anime, chasing around Misty's sisters, random women, stuff like that. One of the more memorable strips has Brock practicing his flirting skills with his Vulpix, who's clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Then there's one where Ditto transforms into a hot chick, Brock catcalls at her. Then even after it's exposed as Ditto, Brock's still down for it. But probably the most original and extensive recurring plot was the one devoted to Metapod, who's very philosophical and depressed because of his immobility. The problem was, they weren't very funny, or even entertaining. With very few exceptions, the comics were just plain bad. On this channel, we usually leave our opinions aside, but most of y'all will never read the comics outside of this video, so we hope you'll forgive us for feeling we need to slip on our reviewer hats. And hey, our criticisms line up with a lot of the critiques levied back in the day. But we know what's good or bad is subjective and a matter of taste. So here, we'll let you make up your own mind while we read one of the Metapod strips. Psyduck says, "Metapod, how can you enjoy being ambivalent? It makes my head hurt." Metapod replies, "But Psyduck, ambivalence frees me from the pressure of having to be sure about my choices. Of course, I might be happier if I was sure of some things. I guess I'm just ambivalent about ambivalence." Then Psyduck hams it up for the camera. Unfunniness aside, most kids wouldn't even know what ambivalence means. But there's a lot of y'all watching, and maybe some of you thought that was hilarious. So let's do one more. Here's Ash and his mom watching TV. The news is talking about how the stock market's doing, the Slovakian embassy, and the presidential inauguration. When it switches over to a Pokemon battle, Ash takes out his earplugs and proclaims, "The secret to life is knowing when to pull out the earplugs." What is funny is this entire thing was the Pokemon Company's attempt to win over American adults. Maybe that explains the sometimes high-level vocabulary. Talking to Japanese Nintendo Online magazine in 2000, the so-called father of Pokemon, Masakazu Kubo, explained the brand's next big step for global dominance. Quote, "What I'm most intrigued by now is the expansion into newspapers in America. If it's a success, Pokemon will be like peanuts. Up till now, all the creativity behind Pokemon came from Japan, but now Americans are coming up with their own ideas to expand the Pokemon brand in entirely new ways. Getting into newspapers will be the first time Pokemon culture is presented as something for adults. I'm incredibly excited about it." Maybe this targeting of adults explains why the comics put so much focus on Ash's mom, but honestly, these strips were more likely to make adults hate Pokemon and think it's stupid. We could read you a bunch of them, but we'll just take a quick look at two. Ash's mom says, "That does it. My mind is set. I won't let Ash's Pokemon get to me anymore." Then Charmander's raising hell in the background. Mom makes an exasperated face, looks at the reader, and says, "Oh look, my curtains are on fire. Isn't that amusing? Ha, ha." Here's another. Mom relaxing on the couch. She says, a whole hour gone by and Ash's Pokemon haven't gotten on my nerves the least little bit. I'll have to get up at 3 a.m. more often." Besides being not funny, these strips make Pokemon look annoying as hell. According to the guy writing them, Gerard Jones, he wasn't much of a Pokemon fan himself. He got a lot of his Poke knowledge from his son Nicky, even though Nicky's quote allegiance had shifted to the competition. We take that to mean the Jones kid used to like Pokemon, but now he was on Team Digimon. Or maybe he meant Yu-Gi-Oh! Regardless, the author's lack of Poke experience shines through in his work. Stuff like referring to the Orange Island simply as Orange Island, as if there's only one. Or when Misty says her Staryu evolved from rigorous training, when Staryu actually evolves via Waterstone. Also, Ash and friends have to go to school. Not Pokemon school, but like actual school, where he learns about the 14th Amendment and the Electoral College. Very strange. And maybe this is getting into nitpicking territory, but a lot of the Find the Pokemon puzzles were stupidly easy, especially if they're supposed to be for adults. Here, try one out for yourself. Can you find Oduo? There it is. How about Ninetales? Yep, you got it. Also, this Connect the Dots Sunday puzzle's supposed to give us a Pokemon. Here's the solution they printed a week later. It doesn't look like any Pokemon we can think of. Deformed Meowth, maybe? And also, look, we love Ashura Ito. Very skilled artist, love his work. But it seems like he was trying to mesh his distinctive art style with what he thought American funny papers were supposed to look like. And a lot of the time, the results were just not great. Especially when Pikachu winks at the reader. It's a little funky. Also, his work here looks a bit rushed. A lot of Sunday strips fail to fill in pieces of the background, leaving empty space where there should have been color. In Pokemon Story, Ishihara and the other execs talk about how they're worried the comic's quality will suffer because they've got a rush while Charles Schultz is on his deathbed. In that same meeting mentioned earlier, someone says, "We want very much to put out good content, but we don't have time. We don't want to miss this window of opportunity." Then Kubo says, "We can do it. Those restrictions will be motivation. We already have the characters. We have the game story. We aren't starting from scratch." He wasn't wrong. If history's shown anything, it's that virtually any product with Pokemon stamped on it's guaranteed to print money. Unfortunately for those execs, this comic was so bad it managed to be the exception. Sometimes the story thread took weeks to get to the punchline, but the payoff was rarely worth the wait. One example, after Ash loses his battle against Gary, Clefairy spends 3 weeks blaming itself for the defeat, hiding in a cupboard, feeling insecure, crying, seeking reassurance. It just keeps going. Eventually, Ash's other Pokemon throw a party to cheer it up, but by then the reader's probably forgotten why Clefairy was even depressed in the first place. The comic seems conscious of that fact. The in-strip characters can't remember either. Then Bulbasaur turns to the audience and says, "Too bad we didn't clip and save those strips." The comic was cancelled almost immediately afterwards. Team Rocket make their first and only appearance in the final installment. Then Ash tells the reader, "Well, I guess we won't be seeing you in the funny papers anymore." So, long story short, it was bad. It failed to capture the hearts of American adults and probably didn't do much for the kids either. It certainly didn't bring in the billions of dollars the execs expected. All told, it only ran for 6 months before cancellation, from September 2000 to March 2001. Somehow, the story gets even worse though. Years later, the comic's author Gerard Jones was arrested for possession and distribution of, we don't want to get demonetized. Let's just say it wasn't comics, but it was the kind of kiddie material that lands you in federal prison. A lot of it, actually. It had been going on for years. He uploaded some to a private YouTube channel, and it was YouTube themselves who called the cops. Jones did his time, and he's a free man nowadays. We could have reached out to him for some behind-the-scenes info like we usually do in our videos, but this time, we're good. With the Pokemon comic ending in abject failure and its author's crimes disgracing its already tarnished legacy, it's no wonder the Pokemon Company never acknowledges it. Fans don't seem interested in carrying its flag either. We couldn't find a single YouTube video about it, or even on this day in Pokemon history kind of tweets that are common for every other corner of the franchise. In fact, the last time anyone tweeted about it at all was over a year ago, from some guy lamenting that no one ever talks about it. Well, here you go, Jimmy. And like we said before, if you folks at home want to trot down memory lane, as of today, the entire series is freely available on Internet Archive. We've been kind of brutal, but now with our reviewer hats off and our preservationist hat slipped back on, there's probably some folks with nostalgia for Pikachu Meets the Press. So for those folks, we hope y'all can still enjoy them. Links down below.
Did you know? Fans predicted the announcement of Pokemon HeartGold and Soul Silver a week before their official reveal. The Japanese TV show Pokemon Sunday teased a big announcement for the following week. Behind the presenters were 2 confetti-filled balls, 1 gold and 1 silver, something viewers quickly picked up on. The precedent set by Fire Red and Leaf Green led many to correctly guess that Gold and Silver would be the next games to be remade. Perhaps because of this, Nintendo decided to reveal HeartGold and Soul Silver 3 days early. The development of HeartGold and Soul Silver was influenced by many of the series' past successes. The original titles were made to be the ultimate Pokemon games, as nobody on the team thought the series would continue after Gold and Silver. They thought the series would decline in popularity based on previous trends. However, the success of Gold and Silver demonstrated the series' staying power, and so producer Tsunekazu Ishihara founded the Pokemon Company to manage the series' brand and marketing. Despite their eventual success, the games weren't created without issue. Developing the special Pokemon Blue and Yellow games led to setbacks in production of the original Gold and Silver. To help fill the gap made by these delays, Ishihara approved the release of the Pocket Pikachu, a pedometer with a screen where Pikachu would appear happier the farther the player walked. An enhanced version known as Pocket Pikachu Color Gold and Silver was also released after Gold and Silver. Creatures Inc. were later involved in making the pedometer bundled with the 2008 Nintendo DS game Personal Trainer Walking. Ishihara again was involved in the project, and even used the pedometer in his personal life by attaching it to his dog's collar during walks. One day during a walk, the device fell off, and Ishihara assumed it was lost until he found it a month later in a muddy puddle. He was impressed that the device was still fully functional, and wanted to use it with HeartGold and Soul Silver. Ishihara's idea would become the Pokewalker, a pedometer bundled with the games that allowed players to walk their Pokémon. Internally, it was considered something of a successor to the Pocket Pikachu. As the Pocket Pikachu Color launched after Gold and Silver, the team wanted to release a similar device alongside the remakes to show how both the tech and Pokémon had expanded. The team were encouraged to bundle the Pokewalker with HeartGold and Soul Silver after the success of the wireless adapter that was bundled with Fire Red and Leaf Green. Interestingly, development of the wireless adapter for Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green gave the hardware team valuable experience with wireless technology, which they would later use while designing the Nintendo DS. The proposal document for the Pokewalker was about 3 times thicker than the document for the Pocket Pikachu. Though the Pokewalker dropped many features from the original, some additions exceeded expectations. Originally, the plan was to have a handful of Pokémon that could be sent to the Pokewalker, but this was expanded to include every Pokémon. The Pokewalker was also influenced by the Pokémon anime. The concept of Pokeballs shrinking in size was pioneered by the anime, and the look of the Pokewalker was deliberately meant to match the size of the shrunken Pokeballs. The size was also altered to improve its ability to withstand water, inspired by Ishihara's dog walking story. The Pokewalker ended up being more impressive than the pedometer it was based on. In a study conducted by Iowa State University, several different pedometers were tested for accuracy when used by someone walking on a treadmill. In comparison to top brands like Digiwalker and SenseWare, the Pokewalker was actually found to have a significantly lower margin of error, making it one of the most accurate pedometers on the market at the time. The researchers who conducted the study also praised the Pokewalker for helping to make exercise more appealing to children by incorporating video game functionality. Another interesting detail is that the music used in the Pokewalker menus is actually a new rendition of the music heard when using the Game Boy printer with Pokemon Yellow, Gold, Silver, or Crystal. The GB Sounds feature let players listen to the original Game Boy music as they played. However, several of these tracks had to be painstakingly recreated, as they didn't exist in the MIDI format. And tracks such as Unknown Radio posed even more problems, as they were programmed to work directly with the Game Boy's chiptune audio hardware. Additionally, some new tracks had to be composed for some areas. Cerulean City didn't have its own unique music in Generation 2, and other areas like Route 47 and the Global Terminal didn't exist in the original games. Composer Go Ichinose had difficulty making new battle themes for Ho-Oh and Lugia, which both used the standard Wild Battle theme in Gold and Silver. He asked the original game's composer, Junichi Masuda, to give him an idea of what Lugia's theme should be. Masuda played him just 3 or 4 notes, but these were enough to convey the feeling of the theme, and Ichinose finished the song with ease. Ho-Oh proved to be more difficult, as he envisioned it being a peaceful creature. The difficulty came when trying to convey the serenity in a climactic battle theme. Ichinose submitted many proposals, but each one was rejected as it didn't reflect the power and glory of Ho-Oh. The deadline was met, although Ichinose had to tone down the track's peacefulness. HeartGold and Soul Silver were also influenced by the release of the Nintendo DSi, which launched a few months before the games. Many more Pokémon were added to the games to accommodate players that were unable to trade from the Game Boy Advance games due to the DSi's lack of a Game Boy Advance cartridge slot. The games also have several regional differences. The sages featured in the games had their designs changed, but only for the Korean versions. The sprites had their prayer beads removed and a red robe added on one of their shoulders, and they were renamed to ascetics. These changes were most likely done for religious reasons. There's also a glitch that's exclusive to the Japanese versions. In the Slowpoke Well, there's a place where the player needs to use strength in order to push a boulder out of the way. In the Japanese version, the player is actually able to push this boulder into the water. Even when surfing, the player can continue to freely push this boulder around in the water, although it ultimately doesn't do anything. In the Japanese games, the Game Corner used the slot machine minigame that had been a staple of the series since Red and Blue. However, the international versions of HeartGold and Soul Silver used another minigame known as Voltorb Flip. This was due to a change in European legislation that automatically earned any game with gambling a 12+ rating. The data for the Game Corner area can still be found in the international version, alongside an unused map icon for the Pokegear. This icon resembles Crystal, the female playable character from Pokémon Crystal, perhaps suggesting her design was planned to appear in the remakes instead of Lyra. The game has other potentially cut content. The internal list of attacks that Pokémon can learn officially includes 467 moves. If the player hacks the game to give a Pokémon a move numbered 468, 469, or 470, the moves will actually work as special attacks with a base power and accuracy of 110 pp. Using moves numbered above 470 will simply cause the game to crash, which could indicate at least 3 more moves were planned at some point in development. Many files relating to the Underground from Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum can be found in the data for HeartGold and Soul Silver, suggesting this feature was meant to make a comeback at one point. There are 2 notable unused items also hidden in the game's files. The first is a photo album that would have held any photos the player took during the game. In the final release, photos are simply stored in the player's PC, making the album redundant. The second unused item is known as the Lock Capsule, which according to its in-game description, can only be opened with a special key. When hacked into the game, the item does nothing. Its original purpose was to be transferred to Pokémon Black and White, where the player could take it to Mr. Lock in Castelia City in order to receive a TM for the move Snarl. If the player obtains the legendary Pokémon Arceus through a special giveaway in HeartGold and Soul Silver, they can access the Sinnoh Ruins area, where they receive their choice of a level 1 Palkia, Dialga, or Giratina. It's actually possible to visit the Sinnoh Ruins a second time, but only if the player has a second Arceus obtained from an in-game event in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl that went unused, meaning that this second trip is normally impossible. Should the player hack the game to make the event happen, the hiker who greets them will have new dialogue welcoming them back, and the player will be able to obtain one of the 2 Pokémon that they didn't choose the first time round. HeartGold and Soul Silver were also programmed with built-in anti-piracy protection. If the game detects that it's being played on an emulator, it will simply freeze at the start of a Pokémon battle and leave the player's Pokeballs spinning.
Did you know? While the name Pikachu may seem like it's inspired by the pika, a mountainous rodent, the name actually comes from 2 Japanese onomatopoeias. According to series creator Satoshi Tajiri, the name is a blend of pika pika, the sound for electricity sparking, and chu chu, the sound of a mouse squeaking. Similarly, Pikachu's evolution Raichu comes from Rai, the Japanese word for thunder, and chu. As the series mascot, Pikachu has received a lot of public attention. The character has appeared on airplanes, as a balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and even as an official representative for Japan's soccer team during the 2014 World Cup. But, unthinkable as it may seem today, Pikachu was not always planned to be Pokemon's biggest icon. In an interview with Time Tokyo, Tajiri revealed that Pikachu only became the face of Pokemon during the pre-production on the animated series. Tajiri said, "When they did the anime, they wanted a specific character to focus on. Pikachu was relatively popular compared with the others, and potentially both boys and girls would like it. They heard a lot of opinions about this. It wasn't my idea." Pokemon's first manga adaptation, named simply Pokemon Pocket Monsters, didn't initially star Pikachu. Predating the anime by about 5 months, the book instead featured Clefairy as the protagonist Red's partner. According to Joseph Tobin in the book Pikachu's Global Adventure, The Rise and Fall of Pokemon, Clefairy was chosen to make the book more engaging. Because of this, it's possible that Clefairy could have been the face of the series if it weren't for Pikachu's popularity in focus tests. And since the character is yellow, a primary color, it was theorized that Pikachu may be more recognizable to younger audiences. There was also less competition among yellow characters at the time, with the only standout example being Winnie the Pooh. Another surprising fact is that series artist Ken Sugimori didn't design Pikachu. He simply did the final illustration for the character. Instead, Pikachu was designed by Atsuko Nishida, who allegedly helped design around 30 of the original 151 Pokemon. Like most Pokemon in the anime, Pikachu communicates by saying some or all of its name. However, unique to Ash's Pikachu are recognizable phrases that have specific meanings. Pika-P, for example, means Satoshi, which is Ash's Japanese name. Pikachu's speech was also once planned to be even more diverse. Originally, Pokemon were supposed to gradually learn Japanese over an extended period of time, with Pikachu planned to speak similarly to a baby. These ideas were, of course, scrapped. Pikachu's voice actress, Ikue Otani, was initially disappointed by her lack of a full speaking role. This disappointment left her when she realized her performance was being heard by audiences worldwide. Due to a misunderstanding, Atani thought she was auditioning for the part of Pikachu's rival, Meowth. She appeared at the audition with the wrong script and nearly missed her call to audition for the character. Atani's voice was also featured as an Easter egg in Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, and is used instead of a traditional cry if the player imports their Pikachu from Pokemon Yellow. Pikachu did eventually learn the language of humans, speaking in a comically deep timbre voice in the adventure game Detective Pikachu: Birth of a New Team. The fan-made English trailer by the YouTube user TealHollow1 imagined how a Western version might sound, dubbing Pikachu with lines by American actor Danny DeVito. The trailer helped spark a push to have DeVito voice the character, but the actor publicly declined, stating he'd never even heard of Pokemon. Pikachu's impact can be seen extensively in the real world. Each year, the island nation of Niue releases commemorative coins depicting characters from various franchises. These coins were made to heighten global awareness of Niue and its economy, and have featured franchises such as Star Wars, Doctor Who, and various Disney properties. In 2001, the country released commemorative Pokemon coins, displaying Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, and of course, Pikachu. The coins have since become collector's items, fetching a high price online. Another example of Pikachu's fame took place in the Lower District Garden of New Orleans, where a 5-foot-tall Pikachu sculpture appeared overnight. This statue appeared on July 31, 2016, during the height of Pokemon Go's popularity. It remains unclear who was responsible for the stunt, or how they erected the statue without anybody noticing. The statue was removed soon after, and the anonymous artist auctioned it off. The sculpture was sold for $2,000, and the proceeds were used to restore the park's fountains. Pikachu even influenced the naming of a retinal protein. The protein Pikachurin was discovered by researchers at the Osaka Bioscience Institute in 2008. Pikachurin is essential for transmitting visual electric information to the brain, and is important for tracking moving objects. Without this protein, information would take many times longer to reach the brain. The protein was named after Pikachu due to the character's association with electricity and speed, and its discovery will potentially lead to better treatment for vision disorders. Pikachu's fame soon led to the Pokemon getting its own game, Hey You Pikachu. This was one of only 2 games to use the Nintendo 64's voice recognition unit, and the only one released in the West. However, the title was never released in Europe. A number of alterations were made to the game's American version, most of which relate to cultural differences. In the Japanese version of the game, shoes can be seen outside a glass door of the player's room. It's customary in Japan for people to take their shoes off before stepping indoors. The shoes were removed in the American version, as this custom is less common. The game also references the Nintendo 64, which can be found in the player's home, and while the N64 looks accurate in the American version, the model in its Japanese version is fairly inaccurate. The console has 2 gray lines running down it, and its cartridges resemble that of an American Super Nintendo. When the Nintendo DS was unveiled at E3 2004, a line of tech demos were shown to illustrate the system's features. One of these games, simply titled Pikachu DS, was compared to Hey You Pikachu by those who played it. Similar to the N64 game, the player interacted with Pikachu in various ways, this time using the DS's touchscreen. In the US TV spot of Hey You Pikachu, a girl asks her brother how he knows Pikachu is a boy. Although this wasn't a feature at the time, it is now possible to tell what sex a Pikachu is at a glance. One of Pikachu's signature moves, Volt Tackle, is named Volt Tecker in Japanese. The name references a move used by Pulseman, the hero of Game Freak's previous project before Pokemon. Pulseman's Volt Tecker is named after the signature move of the Tatsunoko character Tekkaman, Volteka.
There's a war raging in the world right now between popular characters. There are more monsters and cute girls than you can shake a stick at. I don't have such lofty dreams of creating something that will last for perpetuity. Ken Sugimori, 2017. Pikachu is one of the most recognized fictional characters in the world, but someday it'll be completely forgotten, along with every other Pokemon. Ken was a lonely kid growing up, only able to make friends by drawing manga. Despite his parents' protests, he ran away from home to pursue his dream of becoming a manga author, a mangaka. But life had other plans for him. One fateful day, he skipped school to meet up with a kid named Satoshi, which ultimately led to Ken becoming art director of the biggest multimedia franchise in human history, Pokemon. Deciding to play hooky changed Ken's life and to some extent the whole world. But even after all those billions and billions of dollars, he still wanted to be a mangaka. Now closing in on 60 years of age, Sugimori's finally had to lay that dream to rest. He's far outlived his usefulness, and his art was never even that good to begin with. Or at least that's the way he sees it. Those are his words, not ours. By the end of this video, we expect you'll see things differently. This is Ken Sugimori. For a man who drew all this and much more, it's shocking how little of his life story is known to the public. Look him up on Wikipedia and everything he ever did is condensed down to a couple paragraphs. Short as it is, it's still got some errors. Even his place of birth is incorrect. Search the internet in Japanese and you won't find much more than in English. The man's practically a ghost. The only way we could learn more about Sugimori was by buying some old Japanese books, translating a few hundred relevant pages, and piecing the puzzle together. So let's start at the very beginning, long before Pokemon. Ken Sugimori was born January 27, 1966 on the island of Kyushu in Fukuoka's downtown Hakata district. His father loved manga, so he grew up surrounded by the classics. But his dad also worked for the TV channel NHK, which required the Sugimori family to move around a lot, to Nagano, Nagasaki, Yamanashi, Tokyo. And as a result, Ken was constantly switching schools and had a hard time making friends. He was good at drawing though, and realized sketching manga was a good way to start conversations with other students. The 70s were a golden age for manga and anime, and Ken could draw popular characters better than anyone, especially Gundam. And when other kids caught a glimpse, it was an instant icebreaker. He filled up entire notebooks with manga and drew them in the margins of his notes during class. At one school, he made a group of friends where he'd draw one page, then another kid drew the next, and so on, till they had a 16-page story. They made hundreds over several years, and Ken still treasures and keeps them to this day. These formative experiences making friends with his art left Ken dreaming of becoming a professional mangaka when he grew up. In his mid-teens, he found a new obsession: arcades. Back then, no one knew who made video games, Sugimori recounted in the 2000 book Game Maestro, Volume 4. I was obsessed, so I'd research and investigate, and I'd say Galaxian was made by a company called Namco. The original Space Invaders was made by Taito, and the other Space Invader-like games are all copies, trivia like that. It was an era where I really wanted to share this kind of knowledge, but no one understood. One day, now living in Tokyo, he popped into a magazine shop and his gaze happened to wander to a video game magazine. It was amateur, homemade, and stapled together, a doujinshi. He'd never seen anything like that. Back in those days, strategy guides, gaming magazines, internet forums, none of this existed yet. This doujinshi Ken held in his hands was Game Freak issue number 1. He bought a copy and pored over its pages. It was full of interests and opinions he shared, and contained gaming trivia even he didn't know. I thought it was amazing, he recollected, but while the contents were good, the visuals were lacking. There was no way to screenshot games back then, so all the pictures were hand-drawn, poorly. Game Freak was made by some kid a little younger, Satoshi Tajiri. So, Sugimori mailed him a letter and some illustrations saying he'd like to make the doujinshi's artwork. Satoshi wrote back, saying welcome aboard. The two high schoolers exchanged letters for a while, until one day Satoshi invited Ken to an arcade trade show. It was for industry insiders only. Satoshi spent a lot of money collecting arcade circuit boards, so he was on the invite list, and managed to secure Ken one extra ticket. It was on a weekday though, so Ken dressed up in his school uniform and told his parents he was off to class, then skipped school, ditched his clothes in a train station locker, and ran off to the trade show. Problem was, he still had no idea what Satoshi looked like. He'd have to find him amongst the crowds. All the trade booths had sign-in sheets. When Ken signed his name, he saw Satoshi's a few lines above. I figured he must be close and looked around, and sure enough, there was this tall, lanky guy at the next booth over writing the name, Tajiri. The two immediately hit it off and became the best of friends, spending countless meals and train rides together, talking video games and staying out late nights at the arcade. In '84, 18-year-old Ken graduated high school, 1 year earlier than Satoshi, so he had to step into adult life all on his own. He had no plans to attend college and still determined to become a mangaka, but his mom and dad didn't approve of him lazing around the house drawing all day, so he ran away from home and rented the first cheap apartment that he could find in Machida, the same neighborhood where Satoshi still lived with his parents. Satoshi loved having his friends so close and quickly moved in his computer and most of his stuff. Before he knew it, Ken's little apartment was the new Game Freak office space. Money was tight with Ken working part-time and Satoshi still on his parents' allowance. They mostly ate cheap ramen noodles and spent half their money on video games. Arcades, of course, but eventually they bought a Nintendo Famicom and got really into Super Mario. And Ken especially liked Princess Peach. Even to this day, if you look at his Twitter page, you'll see he's constantly buying Peach memorabilia. His favorite Nintendo game, however, was the original Metroid. Ken's art greatly improved Game Freak, and their doujinshi became some of the world's first strategy guides, with a cult readership of thousands. One issue explaining how to get 10 million points in Xevious was especially influential. We could probably make an entire documentary about these two teenagers' lives in the Xevious scene, which is very dramatic and very long. Tajiri basically wrote an entire book about it. That's still for another time, so for now we'll keep it short and just say Xevious's significance cannot be overstated. Tajiri's been reclusive from the public eye since the late 90s, but he reappeared in 2015 to interview Xevious creator Masanobu Endo. In that interview, Sugimori and Tajiri agree, quote, "Pokemon wouldn't exist without Xevious. Game Freak never would have made their first game without it, and the mysteries surrounding Xevious greatly influenced the mysteries cultivated for Pokemon." Sugimori said, "I think it's important how Endo kept the mysteries ambiguous. That's why when I get asked questions about Pokemon, I try not to answer too clearly. What I learned and value from my Xevious experience is how keeping things vague can make it more enjoyable." After meeting Xevious's creator as teenagers, the Game Freak guys realized the legend was just flesh and bones, just like themselves. So together with some friends, they started making their own game. All their favorite games centered around one verb: digging, shooting, jumping. So they decided to make a Famicom game based on flipping. Tajiri hired a few more guys, rented an apartment to use as an office, and asked Namco, the same company who published Xevious, to publish their first game. Namco agreed, and 3 years later, Quinty hit store shelves, selling 200,000 copies, a massive win for the team. Every month, Sugimori published a 2-page Quinty manga, but his responsibilities at Game Freak left little time to pursue his dreams of becoming a real mangaka. After Quinty, Game Freak started cooking up their next project, a little game called Capsule Monsters. They figured could be made in about 6 months since it was for the Game Boy. The idea for Pokemon was born when Sugimori and Tajiri were playing Dragon Quest II, and Sugimori came into possession of not one, but 2 rare hats. Tajiri desperately wanted one, but there was no way to get his hands on Sugimori's extra, thus burning the idea of trading into their minds. Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, those were the kind of games everyone was playing back in the 80s. The orthodox fantasy RPGs were what was popular back in those days, Sugimori recollected. But there was also this group of young, ambitious developers who were creating RPGs that took a different path. Our Pokemon Red and Green were developed as part of that trend. It was basically a counterculture movement. The design document imagined a world with over 200 fantasy monsters, most of which could be caught in capsules, battled against each other, and traded with friends over a link cable. Tajiri took it to Ape Inc., the Nintendo-fused studio which just released a popular RPG called Mother. He showed it to producer Tsunekazu Ishihara, who along with Shigeru Miyamoto liked Capsule Monsters enough to fund it and sign on as producers. In the beginning, I just liked to draw kaiju-like monsters, but in a more cartoonish, exaggerated style, Sugimori remembers, but I realized I'd never drawn monsters like that before. I was honestly pretty lost, but I managed to create about 20 or 30 different designs. But their 6-month game plan was dragging on longer than expected, and after spending all their Quinty money on dev equipment, they ran out of cash. So with some help from Ishihara and Miyamoto, it was decided Game Freak would make some smaller games to get some dollars back in their coffers. Half a year later, they released Yoshi on both Famicom and Game Boy, selling 500,000 copies on its first day. Game Freak launched another game around the same time, Jerry Boy for Super Famicom, which won Sugimori an award for character design. He made a Jerry Boy manga as well, plus a few more for Valkyrie no Boken and Shinmaido o Sawagase Shimasu. In 1992, Sugimori directed his first game, Magical Taruru Tokun, for Sega Genesis, based on a popular manga of the same name. Capumon was now completely on ice for about 3 years as Game Freak focused on making games like Mario and Wario and Pulseman, the latter of which saw the now 28-year-old Sugimori returning to the director's chair. Pulseman was a direct challenge to Sonic the Hedgehog, with Sugimori saying, "If Sonic can move at the speed of sound, then Pulseman will move at the speed of light." Now with a fistful of yen, Game Freak dove headfirst back into Capsule Monsters, except now they were calling it Pocket Monsters, due to trademark complications. Unfortunately, Pocket Monsters found itself knee-deep in development hell. Crunch was a serious problem, with guys sleeping at their desks until all 3 programmers quit the same day. It looked like it was going to be the end of Pokemon, until their composer, Junichi Masuda, vowed to learn programming and pick up the pieces. Not long after, their hardware crashed, and they thought they'd lost years of work, the entire project. But again, Masuda promised to learn a new operating system to save the day. At the time, Sugimori was basically art director, but he wasn't officially a Game Freak employee. He was still drawing manga, submitting to publishers, and hoping to become a professional mangaka. But he could see that Pocket Monsters was falling apart, and the only way it could survive was for everyone to pull together and give 100%. That was the day he gave up his mangaka dreams and joined Game Freak full-time. It was the only way to help his friends achieve their dreams. They got some new programmers, including Shigeki Morimoto, who also contributed a few designs, like Mankey and Tauros. Another employee, Motofumi Fujiwara, came up with some Eevee forms, but something was still missing. We need more cute ones, Sugimori realized. And since I was designing from the perspective of a man, I asked female artist Atsuko Nishida to join. Atsuko went on to make Pikachu, Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, and dozens more. Everyone had their own specialties and design philosophies. Then in the end, Sugimori revised everyone's creations and gave them watercolor artwork, thus unifying all their disparate designs into one consistent encyclopedia of 150. By the time Pokemon hit store shelves in 1996, it'd been over half a decade since Sugimori sketched the first monster. Game Freak was hoping maybe they could sell 1 million copies, since that's how many they'd need for trading between friends to be feasible. Sales were slow at first, but gradually picked up as word of mouth spread, especially after rumors surrounding a secret 151st Pokemon. Sales doubled, then doubled again, then again. Usually a game's sales drop off after the first couple weeks, but Pokemon only gained momentum, and finally reached number 1 on Japanese sales charts more than a year after launch. Eventually, Pokemon fever spread westward and sold a total of nearly 50 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling game of all time. It wasn't until 1999 that the reality of it all caught up to Sugimori. I was on the Eurostar train from Paris to London. I decided to get up and go get a drink and walked up to the concession car. On my way up there, 2 kids were playing Pokemon with the link cable stretched across the aisle. As I approached, they lifted the cable for me to walk underneath. That's when it hit me how popular Pokemon had become. I never thought it'd be this huge, or dreamed someday it'd be an anime, or there'd be a movie. Sugimori drew some one-off Pokemon manga, and the entire team immediately got to work on Pokemon 2. Sugimori made a Pokemon based on his childhood pet bird who liked to stand on one foot, and a few more designers were hired to bring in fresh monster ideas. Just like Gen 1, Sugimori redrew and unified all the new monsters added for Johto. The pressure to live up to fans' expectations was enormous, but after a lot of hard work and a 2-year delay, Gen 2 took the world by storm all over again and sold another 30 million copies, proving Pokemon was much more than just a fad. But it wasn't without cost. Tajiri didn't have the stomach for it anymore. Even though Gold and Silver's credits identify him as the director, he'd actually relinquished the director's chair to Masuda mid-development. Then Tajiri faded into reclusive obscurity for the rest of his days, leaving Sugimori as Game Freak's most senior public-facing figure. Unfortunately, he was feeling a little burnt out too. After Gold and Silver were finished, he told a Japanese publication, "There's really not much I can't do with Pokemon. As a world, it's fairly open. That said, yeah, sometimes I feel tired of it. I'm still young, and there's still a lot more I want to do with pixel art." At this point, he was 34 years old. When asked which was his favorite of all of his creations, it wasn't a Pokemon. He said Pulseman from the old Sega game he directed. Over the next few years, the company pushed forward with more and more Pokemon games, releasing them at a quicker and quicker pace. Sugimori solidified his techniques and studied biology every day, like researching real-life birds' skeletal and wing structures to make bird Pokemon. And he'd always use a manga G-pen to outline Pokemon, saying, "A guy who still uses a G-pen, there's not many of us left in the gaming industry. I don't use tools to draw circles either. It's always freehand. I just don't like lines to be too neat. When you draw on paper, the lines look kind of rough when you look really close. I actually really like that. Maybe you could say I have some kind of line fetish. Most manga artists are very careful to clean up their lines, but I actually think it looks cool." Even in the modern digital age, he colors on a tablet like everyone else, but he still outlines with a G-pen because he likes the sensation of drawing on paper. Another design philosophy he follows is that Pokemon shouldn't be too cute or too cool. Quote, "For example, Luxray would have been even cooler if its head was a bit smaller and its eyes narrower. If a Pokemon seems too cool, I might try to give it a little something to make it uncool. Because, in short, if a Pokemon is too cool, it won't capture a player's heart." Even Pokemon created by other designers, he'd revise it to be less cute or less cool, believing it made the Pokemon more memorable. He felt the same way about the series' human protagonists and purposely made them uncool as well. Well, at least in his eyes. During a Gen 3 promotional tour, Nintendo Dream Magazine asked Game Freak how they felt about Nintendo. Masuda gave the kind of answer you would expect. It's a company we can learn a lot from in terms of style and the creation process. They're always like a role model for us. Then it was Sugimori's turn. He said, "Actually, I prefer Sega." After everyone laughed, he caught himself and pivoted, adding, "Nintendo's really a role model." Truth was, he'd been Team Sega since his teenage years, and the Sega Genesis is his favorite console of all time. That's why his Twitter handle is Super32X. He named himself after a Sega Genesis add-on. And when Wii Virtual Console came out, the first games he bought weren't Nintendo. They were old Sega games. Even though he still had the original cartridges and consoles, he just loved them so much he wanted to buy them again. He's always been more of a Sega fan. When Gen 4 was in development, Sugimori felt an urge to return to Game Freak's roots, back to action games like Pulseman. Finally, make some pixel art that wasn't Pokemon for a change. He jumped back in the director's chair and made Drill Dozer for Game Boy Advance and drew a manga for it as well. Drill Dozer got review scores on par with Pokemon, low 80s, and Nintendo Power nominated it for GBA Game of the Year. Unfortunately, the sales were much lower than Pokemon, and it was the last game Sugimori ever directed. Over the coming years, he would gradually scale back his involvement in the Pokemon franchise. After serving as series art director from the very beginning, he gave that job up to his junior, Takao Unno, for HeartGold and Soul Silver. By the time Sun and Moon rolled around, Sugimori was mostly just supervising other people's designs as, quote, an observer, and the only designs he directed were the Alolan forms of old Kanto Pokemon. To be clear, he didn't design them all himself, he just directed their designs. While that was going on, he made the cover art for all 3 Sega 3D Classic collections. The collections didn't even include any Game Freak games, he drew them purely out of passion. Around the same time, he also published an art book, Ken Sugimori Works, which only devoted around 5% of its pages to Pokemon content. The rest was Quinty, Pulseman, manga, and other projects from his decades-long career. He's been explicit over the years how thankful he is for Pokemon's success, but sometimes it's apparent. He never wanted his whole life to amount to just being the Pokemon guy. Sugimori Works includes a 5-page interview where he gets pretty down on himself. He says he wasn't good enough to be a mangaka, and only able to make a living with art because in the 80s, quote, "It's kind of embarrassing to admit actually, but video games were a brand new industry back then, and standards were lower than in other fields. Both the games themselves and their packaging were poorly drawn. It was only when standards were so low that someone like me could get in." He goes on to say he never thought his art was any good, and he lacks confidence because he didn't go to art school, that all the younger designers at Game Freak did go to art school, and he feels inadequate. "I'm worried I'll outlive my usefulness. All I have over the younger artists is experience." One of the interviewer's final questions is if he still wants to draw manga. He basically says no, he's given up on it. Quote, "I drew a promotional manga that was included with Drill Dozer, and I also drew a manga as a pre-order bonus for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon in 2007. That was the last one. He used to draw at home in his free time, but not anymore." So where'd everybody end up? Atsuko Nishida made lots more Pokemon, but left Game Freak to become a freelancer over a decade ago, saying she wanted to work from home and do something other than Pokemon. She's been doing art for other series ever since, but occasionally contributes to Pokemon here and there on a freelance basis. After taking over directorial duties for Gen 2, Junichi Masuda went on to direct most of the mainline games up to the present day. Satoshi Tajiri's mostly been MIA since the late 90s, though staff say he still hung around the Game Freak office as recently as 2016, playing old arcade games and imparting wisdom to the younger devs. As for Ken Sugimori himself, he still lives in Tokyo, still friends with Tajiri, still working at Game Freak, mainly as a supervisor. He's got a Switch and has an affinity for Mario Kart and Animal Crossing, but mostly sticks to older games. Loves cats. He painted his parents' cat after it passed away a few years back. Doesn't draw much otherwise, certainly no manga. But he likes going to art exhibits where they have originals of his favorite childhood manga, standing real close and staring at them. "I don't have such lofty dreams of creating something that will last for perpetuity." The words of a man rapidly approaching 60. It's been a long time since that teenager ran away from home, hoping to become a mangaka. Most artists would kill to be Ken Sugimori, to have their art and characters famous all around the world, made into TV shows, movies, toys, to be the Pokemon guy. But it wasn't the life he wanted, at least not for his entire life. A wise man once said, sometimes you can't escape success. Sugimori doesn't hate Pokemon. He still occasionally posts new Pokemon art on his Twitter, just for fun. But he also posts stuff like Pulseman, and that's kind of the point. The masses never played Pulseman or Drill Dozer, read his comics, or really had any interest in his creations outside Pokemon. But there's so much more to Ken Sugimori, a whole lifetime's worth, just waiting for his fans to discover, to read, play, and enjoy. To us, Ken Sugimori is much more than just the Pokemon guy.
Did you know? Game Freak originally intended for every copy of Gen 1 to be personalized, but Shigeru Miyamoto told them to make different color versions instead. In Gen 1's release version, when you boot up a new game, it randomly assigns you a trainer ID number between 1 and 65,535. This ID system is actually a leftover from a time when there were 65,535 different versions planned. Last year, Did You Know Gaming spent thousands of dollars to make a video series about a lost Pokédex only released in Japan in an official 1996 book simply titled Pokedex, which we had translated by Nobuga Sawada, the man who translated the original Pokémon games. That Pokedex book also includes an 8-page interview with every developer who worked on Pokémon, including programmer Takenori Ota, where he says, "We also considered having each game generate a random ID number the first time it was booted up, and that number would determine which Pokémon appeared in the game." This crumb of information piqued our curiosity, so DYKG's been translating every Japanese interview we could get our hands on ever since, now totaling over 100 pages. Eventually, we found a little more info in the November 1997 issue of Famimaga 64, this time from Game Freak's founder Satoshi Tajiri. Looking back on Pokemon's development, Tajiri said, "The shape of a forest, the Pokemon that appear. I wanted to make a game that would be different for everyone, but it was difficult. So I went to consult with Shigeru Miyamoto from Nintendo, and we ended up deciding to make it so depending on the color, whether red or green, the worlds would be parallel but different." This statement told us that not only were the Pokemon in each cartridge all different, but even Kanto itself was, with locations changing based on your trainer ID number. Eventually, we translated the biggest Satoshi Tajiri interview ever published, which was conducted in May 2000 and printed in a 600-page book called Pokemon Story. The interview itself is 34 pages long, and we'll publish it in its entirety in the future, but for now, we just want to highlight the part where Tajiri says every cartridge was like a different world. He said, "So we randomly assigned auto-generated ID numbers from 1 to 65,000 to every game cartridge. With the cartridge IDs randomly determined, Pokemon caught in those games would all carry that ID number. So long as someone wasn't trading with 65,000 different people, the odds of trading with someone with the same ID were unlikely. With both parties having different numbers, their Pokemon would be entering different worlds when traded. Then, once the number is assigned, it would never change throughout the course of the game." I talked to Miyamoto about how we'd make players understand that every cartridge is different when they buy one, and he told me the system sounded interesting, but it was a bit difficult to grasp. He said if players can't tell just by looking at it, then it won't work out, and it would be better if the game's color or appearance were different. I was shocked when I was allowed to do that. I told him it would really help me out if I could. So it was from trying to differentiate ID numbers that the idea to symbolically change the colors came about. I thought we should do it, but alter the colors for real. We needed to do more to make the different color games have all kinds of details in them that were a bit different. Here, Tajiri says 65,000, but the exact number was 65,535, which is the highest number that can be represented by an unsigned 16-bit binary number. Or, to put it in simpler terms, 65,535 is the biggest number you can use on a Game Boy without slowing down the entire game and overcomplicating the programming. There were only 9 developers working on Pokemon, so it's difficult to imagine they'd try to build 65,000 different versions of Kanto by hand, especially since it took them 6 years just to make the base game. So, Game Freak probably would have had to use randomly generated landscapes, similar to what they did a few years later in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game. games on Game Boy Advance and DS. Randomly generated environments were possible on the original Game Boy and can be found in games like Dragon Quest Monsters and Shiren the Wanderer, but those games came out after Pokémon had already released. Though there was at least one Game Boy title with random dungeons that came out before Pokémon, a 1991 game called Cave Noir. However, it was so simple that Tajiri probably would not have been satisfied with that level of quality. And his idea was slightly different, in that the game was not going to randomize during gameplay, but rather all at once right from the beginning, which meant Tajiri was swimming in uncharted waters, and it sounded like he was having difficulties wrapping his head around such an ambitious idea. Pokémon did break new ground in many ways, like being the first game to allow trading through the Game Boy link cable, but producing 65,000 Kantos would have been significantly more complicated. In that 34-page interview, Tajiri went on to say that after Miyamoto convinced him to give up on the idea for 65,000 different versions of Gen 1, he still wanted to make between 5 and 7 different color versions, but he realized even 7 iterations of the same game would be tricky. Not only in terms of development, but even outside forces like the factory not wanting to produce multiple cartridges and packaging for what they viewed as an identical product. So eventually he had no choice but to settle for less. In Satoshi Tajiri's biographical manga, there's a 6-page interview where Miyamoto tells us what happened next. He says, "I came up with the slogan, 'The game begins when you choose a cartridge,' and we made models for 3 colors, red, green, and blue. Then later in development, we narrowed it down to just 2 versions, and it looked like we were going to use red and blue, but we ultimately decided that Venusaur's design was so good that we released red and green instead. And so, over the course of a few months, 65,000 variations were whittled down to just 2, featuring different version-exclusive Pokémon, different encounter rates, and various other small changes, like which Pokémon you can buy at the Game Corner. This format of releasing 2 different color versions of nearly identical games continued into all future generations. However, it's a fun thought experiment to consider how different the series might have been if Miyamoto left Game Freak to their own devices. If there had been 65,000 different versions of Kanto, presumably the same format would have been carried over into Johto, Hoenn, Sinnoh, and every other Pokémon region. Just imagine playing with your friends and looking over their shoulder to see how different their world is compared to yours. Or, to put it in more modern terms, imagine watching your favorite Let's Player as they explore a game with details you'll likely never experience firsthand. And just think about what it would have done for replayability. But these are far from the only secrets we've discovered on our journey, so we figured we'd share all the other development secrets within those 100 pages of interviews, like that Gen 1 almost didn't have multiplayer Pokémon battles, and that the only player-to-player interactions would have been buying, selling, and trading Pokémon to and with each other. In fact, multiplayer battles only barely made it in at the last minute because Nintendo demanded it, and since the Big N was funding development, Game Freak had no choice but to comply. But they did it in the laziest way possible, a system where you just watched Pokémon fight on their own, with zero input from the player. Gen 1 programmer Shigeki Morimoto explains it best in that 1996 Pokedex book, saying, "President Tajiri had wanted us to implement battling for a while, but I personally didn't find the idea very interesting, and just thought it would be a pain to program. It looked like we would run out of time and would have to scrap the battling feature, but Nintendo made it clear they wanted battles in the game, so we had to make it happen. So I just thought, well, no choice then, it has to be done." And the early battles were something you just watched. You would just see there was a battle and who won and who lost. We showed that to Nintendo, and the surveys we got back called it boring. I guess they were right, but we were cutting it close to the deadline, trying to add in battles that the player commands. Ultimately, it's what everyone wanted, so we got it to work with the link cable and made it a reality. Satoshi Tajiri was also in that interview and helped explain how in-game currency would have helped make up for the lack of PvP battles. Every Pokémon would have had a specified monetary value, and you'd purchase them at in-game stores or buy and sell with your friends. According to Tajiri, the only reason the focus on cash ended up being cut was due to hardware limitations. He said, "In Pokémon's early development, you could buy Pokémon with money, but that resulted in the player focusing on saving money to buy them, and less motivation to struggle catching them in the wild. We also thought about making one player pay money in addition to their trade when there was an obvious difference in the value of 2 Pokémon being traded, but implementing Pokémon monetary values was beyond the limits of our programming. Transferring money in the game is very different from wiring money happening in real life, and there were difficulties getting it to work on the Game Boy. There were just too many obstacles to overcome to make it happen. We had no choice but to focus on what we wanted most and give up on the rest. In this case, being able to trade Pokemon was our top priority, so we cut the monetary value feature. Adding a little more info, Game Freak developer Akihito Tamisawa wrote a book in 2000 where he says, "In the initial plan, every town had a shop that sold Pokemon, so you could buy tons of them if you had enough money. But what was once thought of as an outstanding idea to have Pokemon stores ultimately got cut." In Gen 1's final build, there are still a few Pokemon you can buy, like a Magikarp for 500 Pokédollars, and a few more like Scyther and Porygon at the Celadon Game Corner, but buying Pokemon was originally a much more central mechanic. And we can see one of these Pokemon stores in some of Ken Sugimori's earliest concept art back when the game was still called Capsule Monsters. Even HP bars almost got cut in development. Game Freak only made action games prior to working on Pokemon, so much of Red and Green's development was spent fumbling around in the dark. They wanted to make Pokemon as simple to understand as possible. So they removed the use of numbers wherever they could, even in Pokemon battles. In a 2019 issue of Famitsu Weekly, Junichi Masuda said, "Of course we thought Tajiri's idea was fun and exciting, but we had a problem. We didn't have any experience making RPGs. In the final game, HP is displayed with a meter, but at one point in development it was represented with text. We came up with 16 different statuses, descriptions like, 'they're still okay,' or 'it's gonna get pretty bad soon.' But it wasn't very interesting, so we scrapped it." And in the July 2000 edition of Nintendo Online Magazine, Masuda explained that incoming damage worked the same way with phrases like, "that hurt," and "that really hurt," to give players some idea of how much damage they'd taken. But ultimately they realized that the entire system just kinda sucked, so they replaced it with the standard HP system used in most other RPGs. Another scrapped idea we want to talk about is how Gen 1 was originally played for keeps, where if you lost a battle, you lost your Pokemon. In Nintendo Online Magazine, the original Pokemon designer Ken Sugimori said when Satoshi Tajiri first came to him and was trying to explain the Pokemon concept, he said it would be like the Menko cards they played with when they were kids. In case you're not familiar, Menko come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Kids collect these cards and can use them to play a game sort of like battling. Then in the end, the winner gets to keep some of the loser's cards. In Famimaga 64 magazine, Tajiri said he originally planned for Pokemon battles to play out in a similar fashion. The interviewer asked, "Don't you think it would be interesting if when you lost a Pokemon battle, your opponent took your Pokemon, like with Menko cards?" And Tajiri replied, "Actually, I made something like that as a prototype, but in the end, the frustration of having Pokemon you raised taken away from you was too great, so I scrapped that idea." Pokemon's first generation took a lot of twists and turns over the course of its 6-year production, and it's fun to think about just how different the series might have been if they hadn't altered direction at various points in development. We know some of you prefer to read these interviews in their entirety, so today we published a bunch of them in text form. You can find links in the pinned comment below. Did You Know Gaming put a ton of research into this video, so if you enjoyed it, please give it a like and share it with a friend.
We've spent hundreds of hours researching Pokemon myths for this video, combing through countless gaming magazines from across the world, hunting down people involved with the myths, bringing in Pokemon experts to fact-check, and crawling back through time to find out how the myths spread. Today, we're using this research to debunk 3 Pokemon myths, and we're so confident in our research that we're putting over $1,000 where our mouths are if anyone can debunk our debunkings. But more on that later. For now, sit back and relax as we upend some of the internet's more beloved Pokemon myths. First off, likely our most controversial debunking, is there actually any proof that Satoshi Tajiri is autistic? You can find this claim made frequently on YouTube, Twitter, the Autism Wiki, and even the UK's BBC says Tajiri is autistic. But what's the actual source they're all citing? Most of them either don't cite a source at all, or in the BBC's case, they cite this article from theartofautism.com, which doesn't cite a source of its own. Instead, it backs up its claim simply by saying, "Is Satoshi Tajiri autistic?" Satoshi has gone on record saying that he wanted the games to give children the same joy as he had during his bug collecting. People with autism tend to take up collecting as a hobby, so Satoshi gave them and everyone else a gift that only he could create. A whole new thing to collect. And That's pretty much it. But apparently it was good enough for the BBC to use as their source and spread the rumor further. However, there's no record of Satoshi Tajiri ever saying he's autistic, or that any of his friends or co-workers at Game Freak said it either. In fact, one website which repeated the rumor was sent an email by Game Freak's information coordinator Yuri Sakurai, who told them Satoshi Tajiri doesn't have autism or Asperger's, and asked them to delete the claim from their website. At the time, Tajiri's Wikipedia page said he was autistic, and used this site as its source. The site in turn said the British outlet The Independent was their source. In fact, tons of websites say Tajiri's autistic. But where did the rumor actually begin? Working backwards from the websites that do cite their sources, it seems many of them read it in the 2009 biographical book Satoshi Tajiri, Pokemon Creator, which we bought on Amazon and read cover to cover. The whole book's riddled with countless errors, even on the very first page, like listing Diamond and Pearl's release as 2004 instead of 2006. The book makes 2 references to Tajiri's alleged autism. On page 9 it says, "In spite of his record-breaking success, Tajiri is a soft-spoken man who shuns the media and the spotlight. This may be related to his diagnosis with Asperger syndrome, a form of autism which affects social behavior and communication skills." And on page 33, "In spite of Pokemon's global fame and popularity, Tajiri remains a quiet, private person. Some have called him reclusive and eccentric. Many believe these characteristics are a result of Asperger syndrome, a type of autism. While Tajiri has confirmed this diagnosis, he has not discussed it publicly." We reached out to the book's author, Laurie Mortensen, and asked a few interview questions. Apparently, she's written over 100 books, most of them in only a few weeks, and she decided to write about Satoshi Tajiri not because she's a Pokemon fan, but because her kids are fans. Ms. Mortensen also told us her source for the autism claims. Here's her full response via email, unedited. She said, "When I researched this book in 2008, I discovered Satoshi Tajiri's MySpace page that clearly showed a connection with the Aspie community. I mentioned the MySpace source in my original text, however, Kidhaven Press chose not to include it in the book because this book was written for young readers, and they felt that MySpace was an inappropriate site for that age group. MySpace was just the beginning of what would explode into the social media world we're familiar with today. A few years after the book was released, I checked Satoshi Tajiri's MySpace page again, and discovered it had changed a lot and no longer mentioned Asperger's. I wish I would have had the print screen option on my keyboard back then. Since the age of online innocence is past, looking back, it could also be argued that someone else created the Satoshi Tajiri page pretending to be him. At the time, the MySpace page felt authentic. If I was writing the book today, I would handle the research and documentation differently. That MySpace page doesn't exist anymore, but bits and pieces of it can still be found on the internet's Wayback Machine. We'll admit we can't prove it's fake, but we can't prove there's no teapot orbiting Mars either. Just the idea that Satoshi Tajiri had an English language MySpace page in 2008 is pretty laughable, and what's left of it is pretty ridiculous as well. For example, Tajiri's bio said, "I love movies, but my favorite kind are of course the Pokemon ones, my own creation because I'm cool like that." And for favorite TV shows it said, "Pokemon, Pokemon, 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 Pokemon. Gotta catch 'em all." So yeah, we're confident in saying this MySpace page didn't belong to the real Satoshi Tajiri. Some of the other websites saying Tajiri's autistic cite Wikipedia as their source. Tajiri's Wikipedia page first had the autism claim added in 2005 by wiki editor NP Chilla without a source, and 15 years later when other wiki editors eventually asked where he got that information, he never responded. Long story short, this branch of the rumor tree appears to be a case of cytogenesis, a sort of information laundering where claims are added to Wikipedia without citation. Then news sites use Wikipedia as a source to repeat the claim in their own articles, then those articles are pointed to as reputable sources for citation in future articles. Lots of people who ended up spreading the misinformation appear to have a credible source, like the BBC, but when you go digging to see where it all began, you just find some rando who wrote it on Wikipedia. As far as we can tell, this 2005 Wikipedia edit and Tajiri's fake MySpace page spread the rumor far and wide, and the fact it eventually got printed in an actual book gave it an air of legitimacy. We also checked the Japanese side of the internet, and there were a few websites claiming Tajiri's autistic, but they had the exact same citation issues as their Western counterparts. In other words, Japanese fans spreading the rumor don't have a source either, which might be disappointing to hear for some. Just to be clear, we aren't saying there's no chance that Tajiri is autistic. autistic. We're just pointing out that there's never been any confirmation, and that every statement about Satoshi's alleged autism goes back to the same dubious sources. There's no direct evidence to support any of those claims, and no primary source to back them up. So for all intents and purposes, we're classifying this rumor about Tajiri being autistic as false. Another popular fan theory is that Ditto was a failed attempt at cloning Mew, or put another way, scientists screwed up trying to make Mewtwo, and that's how Ditto was born. You might have seen it promoted on websites like Game Rant, Screen Rant, Games Radar, and a bunch of fan wikis. This theory's also been propped up by quite a few YouTube videos that pulled in millions of views, like this one. And this video, by Gamer from Mars. As for evidence, proponents point to the fact that Ditto and Mew have the same color palette, the same shiny palette, the same weight, they're both gender unknown, Mewtwo is said to be the first successful clone of Mew, and Ditto can be found in Cerulean Cave and the Pokemon Mansion. We admit it's a fun theory and we'd kind of like to believe it ourselves, but unfortunately the evidence just doesn't stack up. First off, there's no record of developers talking about any connection between the two Pokemon whatsoever. In fact, they've done nothing but douse cold water on the theory. In 2012, Game Informer asked series director Junichi Masuda about the theory and whether or not Ditto was a failed attempt at cloning a Mew. Masuda replied, "That's the first time I have ever heard that rumor actually." Game Informer then asked, "Is that your only answer?" With Masuda replying, "In terms of how Pokemon are designed, they are each their own living being. The unique thing about Ditto is that it's a Pokemon that can change forms, but each Pokemon we create with its own unique element, so we just make sure they are all individual life forms of their own." Obviously, Masuda didn't have a bulletproof response to a fan theory he'd never heard before, because of course Mewtwo isn't entirely its own unique being. But regardless, his answer was clearly a no. We posted this quote on Twitter last year, but a huge amount of fans refused to acknowledge Masuda as a legit source. Some dismissed it, as Gen 1's credits only list him as a programmer and composer, not a Pokemon designer. But Masuda's been at Game Freak since before the company started developing Pokemon. In fact, he knew Tajiri even earlier from their days attending the same technical college. Tajiri, Masuda, and 7 other core developers spent 6 years making Red and Green in close quarters, and they all worked together to decide which designs made it in, and help do each other's jobs. In a 2018 interview with Japanese newspaper Yomiuri, Red and Green's planner Koji Nishino said, "We didn't have enough people, so job categories were all jumbled, and we really would do whatever. I would make resources within the game, and programmers would make designs as well. So it's not like Masuda was just composing music in a different department for 6 years. Together with Tajiri and Sugimori, he was one of the 3 main devs, and worked with the team throughout his entire career as series director." Some theorists say they'll only accept a direct quote from Ditto's creator, but it seems Ditto is one of the many Pokemon Game Freak came up with as a team effort. According to Ken Sugimori in that same interview, the process of designing Pokemon was complicated, with multiple people putting their ideas together and modifying the design to create a single character. Because of this, we have always refrained from simply saying who designed which Pokemon. So for those who say Masuda is not credible and they're waiting to hear from the one person who designed Ditto, well, that one person probably doesn't exist. Masuda also appears to have first-hand knowledge of Ditto's creation, since a year and a half before he denied the Mew cloning theory, Masuda and Sugimori told @Gamer magazine that Ditto was born as a tribute to the classic yellow smiley face. We know there's a lot of fans who, regardless of what the developers say, still think Mew and Ditto have so much in common that the theory must be true, and it can't all just be a coincidence. So let's look at the facts presented by the theory's proponents, starting with Mew and Ditto having the same color palette. First of all, there were only 10 possible color palettes in red, green, and blue versions, and all 150 Pokemon had to share them. So 2 Pokemon having the same palette isn't unusual. But more importantly, Mew and Ditto's palettes aren't even the same. Here's a side-by-side comparison with each other's hex code. Mew only shares the same palette with 2 other Pokemon, Mewtwo and Jinx, while Ditto shares its palette with 23 other Pokemon. Mew and Ditto's palettes don't match in future generations either. Even the Pokedex's color classification system added in Gen 3 calls Mew pink and Ditto purple. Their shiny palettes are different as well. They might look the same to a casual observer, but a closer inspection reveals the differences, and the hex codes remove all doubt. Yes, they're both various shades of blue, but so were about 50 other shinies in Gen 2. They both weigh 4 kilograms, but 2 Pokemon weighing the same is common. In fact, Bellsprout and Shellder also weigh 4 kilograms. At this point, it's actually Shellder who's got more in common with Ditto. They not only share the same weight, but they're also the exact same height, and they actually do have the same color palette. Of course, we're not saying Ditto and Shellder share some secret connection, we're just pointing out that every Pokemon has many little details in common with lots of other Pokemon. As of this video's publication, there are 9 Pokemon who weigh 4 kilograms, 10 who weigh 5 kilograms, and so on. Mew and Ditto are both gender unknown. That's also true, but Mew can breed with nothing, while Ditto can breed with everything. That's not really the same. It's kind of the opposite. Another talking point is that in red, green, and blue versions, you can find wild Ditto in Cerulean Cave, the same place as Mewtwo, but the cave is home to 27 of Kanto's 79 evolutionary lines, mostly the fully evolved forms, which is more than a third of the entire dex. Practically all the best Pokemon can be found in Cerulean Cave, and what exactly would this imply? That when Mewtwo fled to the cave it wanted to be nice, so it brought Ditto along for the ride? Ditto can also be found on routes 13, 14, 15, and 23, and in Japanese Blue's Rock Tunnel, which definitely weakens the connection since it's all over Kanto and not just Cerulean Cave. In Pokemon Yellow and the remakes, Ditto can also be found in the Pokemon Mansion, which we admit is interesting, but the Mansion scientists could have been studying Ditto for any number of reasons. After all, the 1996 Pokedex book says Ditto is, quote, one of the most enigmatic Pokemon ever, so it's not surprising Kanto's scientists want to put it under a microscope. If you're interested in environmental storytelling, one could argue that half the Pokemon in the mansion wandered in from Cinnabar's natural habitat, like Vulpix, Growlithe, and Ponyta, and the other half were brought to the mansion by scientists who wanted to study them, like Grimer, Coughing, and Rattata, which if you wanted to infer purpose, might have been used as lab rats. Proponents also highlight that Mew and Ditto can both learn Transform by leveling up, but it's not unique, as Mew also learns Metronome by leveling up, which otherwise in Gen 1 can only be learned by Clefairy and Clefable. Another similarity the theorists point to is that Mew and Ditto both have base stats that are even across the board, but Mewtwo actually is a clone of Mew, and its stats aren't even across the board. Speaking of which, Mewtwo weighs 122 kilograms, not 4, which also means there's no reason a clone should weigh the same as the original. Fans of the theory often point out this alleged fact, touted as evidence by the gamer from Mars in his video, but nowhere in the game does it actually say that, or any of the games for that matter. We can't be sure why many think this text is in the game, but it might be due to this scene from Mewtwo Strikes Back.
For years we struggled to successfully clone a Pokemon to prove our theories, but you're the first specimen to survive.
So yes, Mewtwo was the first successful clone, but all the other attempts died. They didn't become new species of Pokemon. And besides, this line wasn't even in the original Japanese version. Speaking of Japan, we looked around the internet in Japanese as well, and found the same sorts of rumor videos and theory posts, but nothing we haven't already talked about, and certainly nothing official. It seems the fan theory is actually more popular in the West than it is in Japan. Simply put, when it comes to the cold hard facts, this theory just doesn't hold up. Half the supporting evidence is false, and the other half is the same sort of coincidental similarities shared between countless other Pokemon. In recent months, we translated dozens of interview pages where Satoshi Tajiri and Shigeki Morimoto go into exhaustive detail about Mew. You can check out our recent Mew Origins video to hear all about it. They talk about hidden F4 phantoms, dogs that don't exist, and countless other details, but they never mention Ditto at all. The Ditto Mew theory's been around forever, so let's move on to a more recent rumor, that Professor Ivy is a lesbian. Or more precisely, that the original head writer of the anime, Takeshi Shudo, liked to think she was a lesbian. This idea has existed on message boards for years as fan speculation, but it wasn't until 2020 that it gained mainstream attention after Twitter user Crimson made a viral tweet presenting it as a fact. Over the next few days, this fact got picked up and promoted by websites like GameRant, Flipboard, Pink News, Pride.com, Comicbook.com, and countless Reddit and Twitter threads. Just to give you an idea how these websites legitimize the rumor, here's what Comicbook.com wrote. The information surfaced in Pocket Monsters, the Animation, a book that Takeshi Shudo penned before his death. The man worked as the writer for Pokemon's original anime, as well as its first 2 films. In the past, the writer has shared his surprising headcanons and desires for Pokemon, and it seems another has come to life. And what might that be? Well, it turns out Shudo believed Professor Ivy was a lesbian, and that is why Brock was devastated after leaving her. We interviewed Crimson, the Twitter user who made the story go viral, and he said he encountered the rumor presented as fact in this message board thread on bulbagarden.net. He told us, "I heard this claim pretty often in the Ane-Poke community, so I'm like, huh, if people are saying this, then it must be true." Crimson is just a normal guy with a few hundred followers, and he thought it was cool, so he tweeted it, never expecting it to go viral. But it did go viral, which made him exclaim, quote, "Oh damn." A lot of fans were thrilled to hear the news, but a few asked for a source, so Crimson told them it came from Shudo's book, The Animation, but he'd never actually read the book. After getting some pushback, he deleted his viral tweet after realizing it might not actually be true, and he didn't want to spread misinformation. As part of our fact-checking process, we did read the animation. There's actually 2 books, and for the most part they're just novelizations of the early anime, starting with the first episode and ending with the showdown at Vermilion City, which means the story ends long before the Orange Islands and Professor Ivy even come into the picture. She's never mentioned even once. Just for good measure, we also checked all 226 entries of Takeshi Shudo's personal blog, where he talks at great length about what he was thinking when he was working on the anime, and he never said anything about Professor Ivy's sexuality there either. The news outlets that promoted the story didn't fact-check before publishing, and they never posted corrections after either. Crimson told us, "My tweet admittedly didn't have too deep of a source, so it feels like these websites just wanted to gain clout for something that may not even be true." Crimson's deleted tweet continued spreading the rumor even to this day. Just a couple months ago, another Twitter user named Dragon Milf screenshotted Crimson's deleted tweet and made it go viral all over again, garnering almost 60,000 likes and getting shared more than 8,000 times. Crimson said he warned Dragon Milfs the claim was dubious, but his warning was ignored as the tweet racked up more and more retweets. We checked in with the Japanese fan base as well, and the earliest suggestion of Ivy being a lesbian we could find was an ancient message board from 2002. It's basically just some random users cooking up fan theories without ever claiming to have an official source. We found a more recent thread where it's mentioned, but the poster says he heard the rumor from foreigners on the internet. No one was able to point to an official source, and almost everything else we found in Japanese was Rule 34. And look, fans can have any headcanon they want, but there's nothing in the show that suggests Professor Ivy is a lesbian, and there's no record of Shudo saying he likes to think of her as one. We spent a lot of time fact-checking this video, but there's always the possibility that legitimate developer quotes are out there somewhere, maybe in a late 90s Japanese magazine no one knows about, that undo what we've said here today. We're confident in our research, but in the interest of leaving no stone unturned, we're offering a $350 bounty on each myth to the first person who can provide a direct quote from Takeshi Shudo or Gen 1's core team that proves any of these myths are actually true. We debunked 3 myths today, so we're putting ourselves on the hook for a total of over $1,000. If that ever happens, we'll post the quote that debunks our debunking in the pinned comment under this video so everyone can see it. And we'll post it on Twitter as well at Did You Know Gaming without the G.
Did you know? Instead of badges, Pokemon trainers almost traveled around collecting belts. Drawing inspiration from East Asian martial arts, the first gym leader would have given you a white belt and the last gym leader a black belt. Game Freak even considered letting you whip your Pokemon with them, like some sort of lion tamer. In our hunt for Pokemon secrets for this video, we went to great lengths to ensure that these facts would actually be something that, roughly 99% of you had never heard of. And one thing we did was have 100 pages of a Japan-only book translated, which was written by Game Freak developer Akihito Tomisawa, and it's where this first fact comes from. In the book, Tomisawa writes, "The development staff decided humans should have ranks as monster trainers. The initial idea was that as the player's Pokemon reached a certain level of strength, they would earn belts like a martial artist." Recreating their conversation, he recalls them saying, "Not just white belts and black belts like in judo, there should be more colors. Well, if you could receive a belt, what if you could use it as a training whip, like a red whip or a black whip or a yellow whip?" Tomisawa goes on to say that ultimately it was too cruel to make the player whip their Pokemon, so the idea got scrapped. Their relationship with the player should be friendlier, like a pet owner, so eventually it was decided you'd earn badges instead. But even though the belt idea got thrown out, actual whips were still very much on the menu. As we've mentioned in the past, this beta sprite shows Trainer Red carried a whip at some point in Red and Green's development, and even though
Reds eventually got taken away, lots of other trainers' whips still made it into Generation 1's final build. Another interesting story we found in our translations was the time Pokemon's creator, Satoshi Tajiri, gave away a copy of Pokemon Red where the player was named Dumbass in a 1997 issue of Japanese magazine Famimaga 64. He tells the interviewer Yuki, "Recently I've been buying used copies of Pokemon at second-hand stores. It's interesting to see the nicknames people give their Pokemon. The player's name on this red one is a real gem. He named himself Dumbass, maybe so the game will say, player is a dumbass in the menu." Then, Tajiri whips out copies of Red and Blue that he pasted homemade stickers onto, which if they still exist, are probably worth a fortune nowadays. After joking around with Yuki for a while, he gives her the custom Red cartridge as a gift, then says he'll give away the custom Blue cart and 5 of his autographs in a contest for the magazine's readers. Yuki wants to keep them all to herself, but eventually they agree Tajiri will also give away his copy of Red, where the player is named Dumbass. Whoever the lucky kid was who won the contest hopefully never overwrote that save file. Our next fact is about where the idea for fossil Pokemon came from. The answer can be found in a 34-page interview Tajiri did in the Japanese book Pokemon Story, published in the year 2000. It's pretty well known that Tajiri caught bugs as a kid in the mountains and forests near his home in rural Japan. His town modernized rapidly as he grew older, and the nature he'd catch bugs in got paved over and turned into a city, complete with an arcade where he'd often skip school to go play video games. As an adult, he combined those two ideas, catching bugs and video games, in order to make Pokemon. But what you probably haven't heard is the longer version of the story he tells in this book, where he says the construction workers discovered tons of fossils as they were paving over his childhood. Construction came to a total standstill until the fossil situation could be sorted out, and during that time, Tajiri and his friends made a habit of going to the site to dig up fossils of their own. He goes on to say that he later took a school trip to the Izu Islands south of Tokyo, and that's how he came up with Cinnabar Island. In fact, the entirety of Kanto was based on his own childhood. Even Kanto's size was based on how far he could ride his bike as a kid. He says, "I was able to ride my bike about 10 kilometers from home. The way riding my bike expanded the world around me was part of my inspiration for Pokemon. When you use a train, you feel like you're taking a trip, so for Pokemon, I wanted to keep things more grounded, like how my friends and I would see how far we could ride from home, to create a world that felt real." A little later in the interview, Tajiri says Generation 2's game world was based on how far he could take a train, which is why the region was originally modeled after the whole of Japan. 18 years after this interview, an early build of Gold and Silver leaked online, finally giving fans a chance to see the region Tajiri was talking about, which ultimately got scrapped and replaced with Johto. And check it out, it's Japan turned on its side. And now for more of a light-hearted tidbit, have you ever noticed Unova champion Alder breaks the rules of the Pokemon world by carrying more than 6 Pokeballs? We found an explanation in a 2010 issue of Japanese magazine Nintendo Dream, where Alder's creator, Yusuke Omura, says it's because he never learned how to use a computer. And also, weirdly, Omura had trouble making Alder not look like Jesus. He says, "As I drew Alder, I thought of him as a charming person, but my initial design was far too evangelist-like. He looked like Christ or something. But I couldn't get that image out of my head, so I consulted with Sugimori, who told me to dial back the evangelist shtick so he'd look like some kind of wanderer. Also, Alder has Pokeballs hanging not only around his neck, but under his cloak as well. That's because he doesn't know how to use a PC, so he's unable to store his Pokemon." Generation 5's art director Ken Sugimori was in that interview as well, and added, "You're only supposed to be able to carry 6 at a time, so having 7 or more Pokeballs is weird. But he can't use a PC, so he carries them all with him, not just his main team. All his balls are just jangling around. Ooh la la." Our next fact actually comes from that 1997 Famimaga 64 interview we mentioned earlier. One question Yuki asked Tajiri was why Porygon exists. Simply put, Porygon was created to be ironic, as a response to all the people who told him 1996 was too late to make a Game Boy game. Here's how Tajiri explains it. "At the time, I didn't see anyone playing Game Boy anymore, and it had lost a lot of its popularity. I was at the barbershop once, and someone asked, 'So you're making a game? What kind of game?' When I told them it's for the Game Boy, this guy I didn't even know said, "The Game Boy? You're a bit late on that one." Everyone kept telling me, "Tajiri, you need to start making Polygon games for next generation consoles." But I was designing Pokemon for Game Boy, where it's impossible to use polyagonal 3D graphics. But people kept hounding me about it, so I thought it would be ironic to include a Pokemon called Porygon. Adults notice the irony, but kids don't get it. They just think, "What a cute Pokemon," and play with it. Once they become a little more familiar with computers, they'll realize, oh, that was supposed to be irony. Pokemon has tons of words that kids won't understand the meaning of until 10 or 20 years later. If you're one of the fans who's realizing right now that Porygon was meant to be ironic, let us know in the comments. If you didn't realize before this video, that means that Tajiri's 1997 prediction actually came true. And our next piece is about how Pokemon was originally planned as a much smaller game, and Pokemon's producer Shigeru Miyamoto didn't even want it to be an RPG. Red and Green launched in 1996, but Tajiri pitched it to Nintendo subsidiary Creatures Inc. back in early 1990, with a contract to finish it in October the same year. In fact, Creatures thought it was going to be so similar to another creature collecting game they were going to make that they cancelled it out of respect for Tajiri. In that Tomisawa book we translated, Creatures chairman Tsunekazu Ishihara says, "To tell you the truth, Creatures already had its own idea for a game like Pokemon, something incredibly similar. The game was called Toto, and it used the Game Boy like an insect cage to be filled with creatures you owned. At the same time we were talking about it, Tajiri brought us his idea for Pokemon, where youths catch monsters and trade them with a link cable. It wasn't a question of which idea came first, but we did think Tajiri would wonder, how could they do this to me when it was my idea?" Ishihara goes on to say Creatures thought the main difference between Toto and Pokemon was going to be the link cable trading, so they ultimately decided not to make Toto. But Tajiri's small idea eventually got a lot bigger, as he explained in another Japanese publication, saying, "We figured we could probably make a Game Boy game in about 6 months. But our goals for Pokemon just grew and grew, so we eventually realized it would be difficult to develop that quickly." Of course, ultimately, our 6-month plan didn't work out. Shigeru Miyamoto liked the idea of collecting and trading monsters because it was an idea that would only work on Game Boy, and he's always loved games that are only possible on the system they're played on. But even though he liked the concept, he didn't think Pokemon should be an RPG. Here's what he said in that Tomisawa book. "At the stage where we just had the basic idea for Pokemon, I didn't care what genre it would be. It was Tajiri who thought it wouldn't be complete if it wasn't an RPG. I was concerned that if we made an RPG, we wouldn't know when we'd finish, and I thought we should just focus more on the essence of the game. But as the producer, it wasn't my call, so Pokemon ended up in the form it is now, and I'm honestly not sure if that was the right decision." Now, more than 20 years later, I guess fans have to ask themselves, would Pokemon be a better series if it wasn't an RPG? What if it was still about collecting and trading Pokemon, but the gameplay was an entirely different genre? Let us know in the comments if you think Tajiri was right to hold his ground, or if he should have listened to his idol, Shigeru Miyamoto. And now we're going to jump back into cut content from Generation 2, so let's talk about one of Johto's lesser-known scrapped areas, the Lost Suicide Forest. That entire Japan-based region was scrapped, but later in development there were also parts of Johto that got cut, but can still be found in the game's internal data. Most of them are just early designs for Johto's cities. Possibly the most interesting is the Lake of Rage, which originally had an entire town built around it. There's also a tiny safari zone, once meant for Fuchsia City. But the map we really want to highlight is this forest, which the data refers to as Fuji. This Fuji forest was originally located at the foot of Mount Silver, which is based on the real-life Mount Fuji in Japan. In fact, in early builds of Gold and Silver, Mount Silver was literally called Mount Fuji. In the real world, there's a forest at the foot of Mount Fuji called the Sea of Trees, also known as the Suicide Forest. It's got a historical reputation as a home to ghosts, and it's one of the most used suicide sites globally, at over 100 deaths per year. The government even puts up signs in the forest that encourage suicidal visitors to think of their families and reach out to a suicide prevention association. By the way, all this information was sent to us by Pierre Carrot, a Generation 2 disassembler and one of the members of Team Spaceworld, so full credit goes to him. In Generation 2's final build, there's only one new ghost type, Misdreavus, who can only be found found at Mount Silver. It's likely the forest was planned as a home not just for Misdreavus, but other ghost Pokemon as well, like these two that got cut during development. But in an effort to avoid the risk of controversy, Game Freak ended up cutting the location and replacing it with this map, which bears no resemblance to the Suicide Forest. Despite its removal though, the forest can still be found, hidden in the game's internal data.
Did you know? The original Japanese opening for the Pokemon anime talks about what's up girls' skirts. The first line in the opening is, "Even if in fire, in water, in grass, in forests, in ground, in clouds, in that girl's skirt. Eek." The line is repeated later in the extended version, ending with, "In that girl's skirt. You're persistent." There's other instances of inappropriate language in the original Japanese anime. The episode The School of Hard Knocks, after seeing a picture of the schoolgirl Giselle, Brock enthusiastically says, "I'll look forward to her in 8 years." In the English dub, this was changed to Brock saying, "She can violate my rights anytime." But in the Kids WB airing of the show, even this edit was removed. The Japanese version also had several religious references that were changed in the English release. The episode Ash Catches a Pokemon was altered to remove a mention of heaven and hell. In the Japanese dub, Ash comments on how the inside of a Pokeball must be a pleasant place for Pokemon to be, then mentions how himself and Pokemon are both heaven. This is followed by Misty saying that Ash's heaven is her hell. In the English dub, Ash proclaims his love for his newly caught Caterpie, and Misty chimes in by saying, "I guess it takes a worm to love a worm." The Pokemon anime was only meant to run for around a year and a half. Due to this show's immense success, it's now one of the longest-running shows on TV. The main character, Ash Ketchum, is named Satoshi in the Japanese release. This name references Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri. Another character is Satoshi's rival, Shigeru, who is renamed Gary Oak in the West. Shigeru gets his name from Nintendo veteran Shigeru Miyamoto, but this reference goes a little farther. Satoshi and Shigeru were some of the default names for the player and their rival in the Japanese Pokemon games. Miyamoto was a mentor of sorts to Tajiri, and their relationship was referenced in the characters' names. In early designs, Ash looked very similar to the player character from the games. His appearance was eventually altered to differentiate the games and the TV show. According to Ash's original voice actor, Veronica Taylor, Ash was named Casey when she auditioned for the role. The name Ash may have been chosen to fit the series' tree-based naming convention. Pikachu's voice was provided by Japanese voice actress Ikue Otani, even in the show's English version.
Pikachu.
Sometimes, however, an American voice actress would take Pikachu's role if the American localizers needed additional takes.
Pikachu.
The character Brock was eventually dropped from the show. This was because the creative team feared Americans would view his appearance as a racist stereotype, mainly due to his eyes. To replace Brock and avoid any stereotyping, the team created a more European-looking character, Tracy. Tracy was replaced by Brock after the team realized nobody was offended by his appearance. Many fans wanted original characters Ash, Misty, and Brock reunited in later seasons of the anime. However, one of the show's directors, Masamitsu Hidaka, revealed that Misty would never come back as a permanent character. In an interview with PokeBeach, Hidaka stated that Misty's presence would prevent the team from continually introducing new female characters to the show. He said that switching out girls provides new eye candy for male audiences, and that girls are more customizable. They can constantly change outfits and wear things like bathing suits. The show's creators also never want to make Ash a Pokemon master. Hidaka has stated that if it ever happens, the show will end. They'll keep adding new badges to earn, new areas to explore, and new Pokemon to capture until that time comes. He also explained that after the anime's first few seasons, the show became more culturally generic due to its international success. This can be seen clearly in Best Wishes and the XY series, where the Japanese text is replaced by a custom set of symbols. This new language actually corresponds to the modern Latin alphabet, and can be deciphered into either English or Romanized Japanese. Removing cultural imagery made the Pokemon world more unique, and also made it easier to localize. Since the text appeared to be gibberish in every language, non-Japanese countries didn't have to bother translating it. Although the show was a hit, it's had to endure plenty of scrutiny. One of its first major controversies came after episode Electric Soldier Porygon aired on TV, hospitalizing around 700 people. The episode is said to have caused vomiting, headaches, irritated eyes, and for a small portion of the viewership, seizures. Because of this, the episode was never aired again, was banned overseas, and the entire show was put on hold for 4 months. The animation technique used is what caused the issue. In the episode, Pikachu uses an electric attack to blow up missiles.
To illustrate the explosion, rapidly flashing red and blue lights consumed the screen. The incident became known as Pokemon Shock and was a disaster for the show. Fans were deeply concerned that the show would be cancelled, but Hidaka has since stated that Pokemon was never in danger of being cancelled due to its popularity. In the original season, a few significant plot holes are never explained. Ash and his friends never traveled to the Safari Zone, so it's never made apparent how he caught so many Tauros. There's a particular episode that covered all these story beats, but was also banned and never aired in America. Titled The Legend of Dratini, this episode has a man named Kaiser point a revolver at Ash and the others. This was intended for comic effect, but the episode never made it to the US due to its pervasive use of firearms. To add to the controversy, the episode contains scenes with Team Rocket's Meowth wearing a Hitler-like mustache. Interestingly, clips from this episode were used in the series' Pokerap segments. Another controversial episode is Beauty and the Beach, which is the first Pokemon episode to be banned in all countries outside of Asia. It was criticized for its depiction of women's breasts and contains many sexual innuendos inappropriate for children. Halfway through the episode, there's a scene where James cross-dresses wearing inflatable breasts for a beauty contest. This scene was intended to be comedic, but ended up getting the episode banned for over 3 years. America later received a heavily edited version of Beauty and the Beach, which was titled The Lost Episode. The Pokemon Jinx was another source of heavy controversy, and had to be banned from the show, then later edited. People complained the character was racist, as it resembled several offensive depictions of black people during the 20th century. Jinx's original design appeared in several American broadcasts, but future episodes had the Jinx scenes removed altogether. In one instance, an episode that featured Jinx prominently, titled The Ice Cave, wasn't aired in America at all. Jinx's design was eventually recolored purple to address the racism allegations. This was first implemented in the games, followed by the show a few years later. The show was also impacted by the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. Despite being created years before September 2001, 2 early Pokemon episodes were taken out of circulation following the attacks. An episode titled The Tower of Terror was removed. Though no official statement was given, it's believed the episode was pulled because its name could evoke memories of the attack. The episode titled Tentacool and Tentacruel was also removed. This was due to the episode's content, which had a giant Tentacruel attacking the city. A character in the episode is also seen using an automatic weapon. Although the episode was temporarily pulled, a shot of Tentacruel striking a skyscraper wasn't cut from the show's opening. This particular episode was also pulled for a short time after the passing of Hurricane Katrina, as the episode shows the damaged city flooded.
The success of the Pokemon anime led to over 20 Pokemon movies being made. One of the earliest Pokemon films, Movie 3, was originally going to be completely different. It involved a real-world T-Rex, and would question what happened to the real-world animals that once lived in the Pokemon world. Writer Shudo Takeshi wanted to introduce real animals into the world, and address questions like why are there real trees and flowers but not real animals, and what's the difference between plant Pokemon and regular plants. This would have been done with scientists discovering a T-Rex fossil. The eyes of the T-Rex fossil would start to glow, and it would come back to life, endlessly striding forward. It would be crushing everything in its path, and even makes its way to Ash's hometown. Ash, his friends, and Team Rocket would all try to stop this fossil's rampage. The dinosaur would have been stopped eventually, but Mr. Shudo never explained how. As this story was being made, no new Pokemon had been announced, and Pokemon Gold and Silver were a while away. As such, there were no new Pokemon for the movie staff to advertise, and the game staff weren't willing to make a Pokemon just for the movie. Shudo was stuck with the original 151 and the handful of Generation 2 Pokemon that had been revealed. The idea was ultimately rejected because a story where a bunch of minerals gain consciousness and come to life won't be a hit. Mr. Shudo says he went home and drowned his sorrows in alcohol after his script was rejected. A few days later, Shudo was set designs for 4 new Pokemon, including Entei and Unknown. A new film would be based around these Pokemon to advertise Gold and Silver. Did you know? The idea for Pokemon Detective Pikachu stemmed from one of the rejected pitches for the Pokemon anime. While developing the anime, the show's staff wanted to have Pokemon talk in full sentences. However, the developers of the original games, Game Freak, felt that Pokemon shouldn't speak at all. While a compromise was reached, with Team Rocket's Meowth being the only Pokemon capable of speaking the human language, many staff members still wanted to hear Pikachu talk. The original concept for the 3DS version of Detective Pikachu was simply to have a Pikachu that could talk and express various emotions. This resulted in a tech demo shown off in 2013, which included a motion-captured Pikachu that would talk to its audience. Game Freak were still reluctant to allow the team to break the rules of the series, and producer Hiroyuki Janai had to spend a lot of time convincing them that it was a good idea. Pokemon Company president Tsunekazu Ishihara was also unsure about the project. When he made an appearance on the Japanese television show Professional Shigoto no Ryugi, the show's blurb read, "This summer, Ishihara started development on a never-before-seen game. It's a new game featuring the very popular character Pikachu in a bold way. There is concern, however, that if it's bad, the long-loved character would lose popularity in the blink of an eye." Fortunately, the Detective Pikachu game was a success. In April 2016, movie studios were allowed to bid for the rights to make Pokemon movies. The franchise was in high demand in 2016, thanks to the massive success of the mobile game Pokémon Go, which saw Nintendo's stocks rise by $9 billion. The rights were eventually won by Legendary Pictures, who were bidding against Warner Bros. And Sony. Legendary winning the bid was seen as remarkable, as they're owned by the Chinese company Dalian Wanda Group. Historically, China and Japan have been bitter rivals, and some thought it was unusual for a Chinese company to be handling a prominent Japanese property. Universal Pictures were later slated to handle the film's distribution outside of Japan and China. However, on July 25, 2018, it was announced that Warner Bros. Would be distributing the film instead. This would be the first Pokemon film they distributed since Pokemon 3, the movie. Speculation arose that this change was a precursor to Legendary forming a new deal with Warner Bros. After their contract with Universal expired on December 31, 2018. Once they obtained the rights, Legendary wasted no time in fast-tracking the movie's production so they could capitalize on the Pokemon Go craze. It was decided, at the behest of the Pokemon Company, that Ash Ketchum would not be the protagonist of the new film. Ash already had a lot of backstory and character development from the animated show and movies, so the company wanted to try something new, starring a new character. Rumors began to circulate that Max Landis, who wrote 2017's Bright, would be providing the film's script. Another batch of rumors stated that Nicole Perlman of Thor and Guardians of the Galaxy fame and Gravity Falls' Alex Hirsch were in negotiations to write the film. When the movie started filming in January 2018, however, the draft was credited to Perlman and the film's director Rob Letterman, with no mention of Hirsch. Letterman was approached with the pitch for Detective Pikachu and, quote, fell in love with the story behind it. Actor Justice Smith was the first person confirmed to have a role in the movie. Interestingly, Smith's character in the film Paper Towns sang the Pokemon theme in a scene along with his co-stars Austin Abrams and Nat Wolff.
Pokemon, gotta catch 'em, it's you and me.
Speaking of music, Detective Pikachu is the second time a Nintendo product used Happy Together by the Turtles in a trailer. It was also used for the Nintendo 64 title Super Smash Bros. Another interesting audio secret comes from the 2018 Pokemon World Championships in Nashville, Tennessee. After revealing the official title for the movie on stage, Rob Letterman asked the crowd to chant as if Pikachu and Charizard were fighting in front of them. This chanting was recorded and used during the film's fight scene between the two Pokemon. The plot of the Detective Pikachu movie loosely follows the plot of the game, with the two versions having many similarities. The protagonist, Tim Goodman, and the location, Rhyme City, share their names between the two versions. Various scenes from the movie also reference other Pokemon games and properties. Alongside all the Pokemon that cameo, locations like the Sinnoh region from Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum are named. Tim's train ticket also shows that he departed from Leavin' Town, a pun on Leaving Town. The staff of the 3DS game were excited at the prospect of their work becoming a full Hollywood production, calling it a huge honor. While working on the game, the most that they'd hoped for was an animated short for Japanese television, and so they were amazed when they were told that it would be turned into a full movie. However, they were also nervous as they had to leave creative control in the hands of Legendary Pictures. When the 3DS version of Detective Pikachu was unveiled, many fans began wondering who would voice the iconic character in English. While the role would eventually go to Kaiji Tang, fans overwhelmingly wished that actor and director Danny DeVito would take the spot. A video titled Great Detective Pikachu English trailer featuring Danny DeVito was uploaded by YouTube user TealHollow1 on January 29, 2016, a mere 3 days after the Japanese trailer launched. The video dubbed over the trailer with voice clips from DeVito's previous roles, most notably Frank Reynolds from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. A Change.org petition asking DeVito to be cast in the role gained over 50,000 signatures before it closed. DeVito's response to the overwhelming fan demand came on the 1st of April 2016, where he was asked during a panel if he would voice Detective Pikachu in the game. His response was a firm no, followed by the question, what the f*** is Pokemon? However, this wasn't the end of DeVito's unwitting involvement with the property. Visual effects producer for the film, Greg Baxter, confirmed to the Nerdist that the team tested audio from DeVito's role in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia for use in the movie. While he liked the voice, it was Ryan Reynolds' voiceover that really struck a chord with the producers. Other actors considered for the role were Hugh Jackman, Mark Wahlberg, and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Longtime Pikachu actress Ikue Otani voiced Pikachu's regular speech in all versions of the movie. In the German version of the initial trailer, though, Pikachu is dubbed with a different voice.
Sie kann ihn doch hören, oder?
Pika Pika!
It's unknown who this actor was or why the voice was changed for this version specifically, as it's identical in all other languages. Regardless, the voice was quickly changed, with Warner Brothers uploading a new version of the German trailer soon after. Reynolds, famous for his guerrilla marketing campaigns as Deadpool, adopted a similar tactic with Detective Pikachu. He uploaded a humorous video to his YouTube channel that parodies method acting, telling viewers how he gets into the role. Reynolds' anecdotes involve leaving his daughters at school because Detective Pikachu doesn't know who those two little girls are, and trying to lose 182 pounds in order to better fit the character. Reynolds not only voiced Pikachu, but also provided motion capture for the character. Pokémon were chosen to appear in the movie based on 3 criteria: their popularity, what the story needed, and what looked good or interesting in a live-action setting. Legendary worked closely with Game Freak and the Pokémon Company to narrow these choices down. They tried to include a good range of Pokémon from every generation, although Letterman expresses a certain fondness for the original 151. Pokémon Detective Pikachu is the first Pokémon movie to incorporate live-action elements. Artist R.J. Palmer is known for his realistic interpretations of various Pokémon, with his art having gone viral online. He began drawing Pokémon as a hobby in 2013, and this directly led to him being approached to work on Detective Pikachu. The film's production designer Googled realistic Pokémon and, after finding Palmer's art, invited him to help work on the film designing the creatures. The first trailer for Detective Pikachu gained more than 30 million views in 2 days on YouTube alone. Upon the movie's reveal, some longtime fans were skeptical about the realistic Pokémon designs, as well as the fact that Pikachu could talk. While the realistic look of the creatures was well received by some, others felt the choice was ugly, considering the series' original simple and cartoony aesthetic. Concerns about the film's popularity were set aside when test audiences responded very positively. In January 2019, 3 months before the Detective Pikachu film had even released, it came to light that Legendary were already working on a sequel. According to HollywoodReporter.com, the studios hired 22 Jump Street writer Oren Uriel to write the script. Uriel also worked on the upcoming Sonic the Hedgehog movie and Men in Black International, but has so far made no comment on his work for the next Pokémon film. Also in January, WeGotThisCovered.com uncovered that 2 new movies are also being made for the franchise. The first will be a spin-off of the Pokémon Mewtwo, which is not the upcoming film Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution, and a movie adaptation of the games Pokémon Red and Blue. Legendary apparently wants to flesh out the events of the games, using live action and CGI to tell the story of Red and his journey through the Kanto region. It seems that both of these projects are set in the Detective Pikachu universe. It appears as though Legendary are launching a cinematic universe of live-action Pokémon films, with one of Detective Pikachu producers seemingly confirming it. Later in March, IGN published an article about their visit to the set of Detective Pikachu during filming in 2018. While on this visit, IGN asked producer Ali Mendez about Legendary producing more live-action Pokémon movies. Mendez seemed to imply a Pokémon cinematic universe was in the works, saying, "Pokémon is such a rich universe. There are so many ways you can go inside it. We're trying to get the first movie right, and then once we've done that, we'll see where we go from there. But absolutely. Even the Pokémon themselves, there are 800 of them. We're going to have a lot of them in Detective Pikachu, but we want to play with all of them at some point." Whatever the case, the future of Detective Pikachu seems bright. The film's opening weekend box office earnings are estimated to be up to $100 million, putting the film in line with several Marvel movies.